Knowledge is information, but not all information turns into knowledge. Today, every company leaves digital footprints in hundreds of different sources. But this information by itself does not tell you who it is you're looking at and what the risks of doing business with them are. Businesses can't exist in a vacuum. They need employees, customers, partners, contractors, investors. Good counteragents help a company succeed, create products, make profit, expand business opportunities. But what about bad ones? 49% of organizations around the world say that they've been victims of fraud or economic crime. 2/3 of Russian companies say they've encountered economic crime in the past 2 years. This is significantly higher than the global average. Every year, 15% of companies simply disappear, whether on their own initiative or because they're forced to do so by tax bodies, often leaving unpaid debts. If you want to minimize your risk, you need to find and analyze every scrap of information you can, identifying, analyzing, collecting facts. Processing big data is impossible without qualified specialists, experience, time, expensive equipment, new technology, machine learning, graphs. Spark Interfax gathers information from all available sources and converts it into knowledge, allowing you to see the world of business in its entirety with all its risks and opportunities. And there's no doubt that tomorrow we'll be able to understand the world of business even better, thanks to the emerging digital economy, cutting-edge technology, and the availability of new information about the lives of companies. Knowledge decreases risks and creates trust, the foundation of any successful business.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Renaissance Capital's 25th annual conference on Russia. It's been a really interesting period for all of us. To launch this conference, we're naturally starting with the Central Bank of Russia, an institution which I think everyone's been so impressed by in terms of its growing transparency, its ability to succeed in meeting its inflation targets. And we're delighted to have Alexei Zabotkin, a man who's got 25 years experience on the buy side and the sell side, and has been taking a senior role at the central bank now for some years. I was personally really impressed by how well he has managed the communication to analysts, the sell side and the buy side in recent months, when the Central Bank of Russia has been moving rates and showing its commitment to getting inflation down. What I'd like to do over the 30 minutes we've got for this session is invite you to ask questions. Do put them in. We will try and make sure there's time for those questions at the end of this session. It's only 30 minutes long. I'd like to hand over to Sofia Donets, who's had some great calls on where interest rates were going to go and growth out of Russia. And I'd like Sofia, if you could lead the discussion, please, and raise some of the points that have been coming up in client meetings. That'd be great. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you will enjoy our conference. Hello, Alexei. It's so good to see you and welcome you to the speech. And I will start with quite a broad question, but I think it's a $1 million question now for everybody. The thing that we start to discuss during our morning coffee and continue throughout each day, and which is not only in the focus for fixed income, but also equity investors. What's your view on the global inflation trends? How sustainable they're gonna be, or how they will be conditional on the recovery path? What's the difference between developed market and emerging market? And finally, what's the policy response we should expect globally and in the Bank of Russia, from the Bank of Russia? Please share your thoughts.
I think this is the question which can be answered only either in a very long monologue or in a very short remark, right? Given that we have only 30 minutes for many questions, I'll defer to the second option. And the short remark is that the inflation is definitely ticking higher, and that's very much the result of the very sharply accommodative policies, both on the fiscal and monetary sides, which were unleashed in response to the COVID crisis. And going forward, it will depend on the path of the recovery, endogenously determined by the already made decisions in the past and the ability of the economy to adjust to the new reality, both on the side of the demand and on the side of the supply side. And clearly the thing which makes the job of the central banks harder than usual is that supply side is much more fluid these days than it's usually assumed in the monetary policy models. So there is a greater margin of error around those judgments for the position of the aggregate supply and its evolution in the future. But I think that at the end of the day, since kind of I'm a very old school orthodox follower of Mr. Milton Friedman, in the long run, the inflation is always the monetary phenomenon. So at the end of the day, the inflation will be that which the central banks in each country permits them to be, right? And assuming that the central banks will live up to their mandates and to those that much greater trust in the monetary policy than it was, say, 10, 20, 30 years ago, both in developed and emerging markets. Kind of, if the central banks live up to their promises, the inflation will be on target everywhere. But to what extent how fast we will converge to that equilibrium will depend on the monetary policy path to a very large extent.
That's great, and in this context, I think that the other very important question is where the neutral rate is. So the central bank continues to reiterate the range of from 5 to 6 in nominal terms for the rate, and I think that what we could see in the curves that the market is pretty much anchored by this estimation. But could it change? Is there any factors behind this that are of some uncertainty for the central bank? And what's about the difference between the short-term and the long-term neutral rate now?
I would like to make a small correction. The central bank's communication for Russia was that the policy rate is the neutral policy rate is judged to be between 1% and 2% in real terms. It's very important to understand that in all macroeconomic models which rely on the notion of the neutral rate, it is a real rate concept. It's not a nominal rate. And yes, 1 to 2% real rate in the long run steady state with inflation at target and the economy at its potential amounts to 5 to 6% in nominal terms if inflation target is 4%, as it is in our case. So, but in the shorter run, of course, there can be deviations, and there are inevitably deviations from the long run equilibrium, and that's exactly what the central bank job is, to assist the economy in reverting to the longer term equilibrium and bringing inflation back to target, or anchoring it at target. And if in the short run the inflation and as a result of that, inflation expectations are somewhat higher than the target, and probably the area of neutrality for the nominal rate is somewhat higher than the long-term equilibrium. In terms of quantifying it, the frank answer is that there is no central bank in the world which has which is brave enough to believe that it can quantitatively estimate from some fancy econometrics the short-term rate, right? It what makes the monetary policy a bit of an art, because you have to use your judgment, right? And I would emphasize that again, what is important for the judgment about the nominal neutral rate is not so much the current rate of inflation, it's the expected rate of inflation, right? Because the economic decisions are driven by the expectations about the future.
Yeah, that's pretty clear. Thank you. For us economists, probably this actually means that the key rate in coming months will could be above 6, but still be in the neutral range, given that the central bank expects inflation to stay slightly above 4% for part of the next year. So that's quite important. But if we're talking about the neutral rate this time, I know that the one option to estimate the neutral rate for the central bank was to look at neutral external rates. And what do you think about those neutral rates globally? Is there any hints that they're actually below what we used to think like 5 years ago? Like, for example, for US, what do you think for the neutral rate? Could that affect the central bank decisions, given that it's pretty low?
It is a factor which influences the domestic neutral rate, as long as the capital account is open, because kind of in the perfectly freely floating capital account situation, your domestic key rate, neutral rate shall be kind of in the first approximation equal to the global rate plus whatever risk premium you believe is justified. But that is a shortcut, and it assumes the free flow of the capital both into the economy and out of it, right? If that assumption doesn't hold, then the direct relationship between the two is not necessarily as tight as the ideal theory suggests. But of course, the global neutral rate judgment impacts, even in that case, impacts the judgment about the domestic key rate, neutral rate. And indeed, it was one of the factors which led us to bring down the assessment of the neutral rate from 2 to 3% real to 1 to 2% real last summer. Kind of half of that came from the view of the lesser countries premium, half of that came from the that revision came from the view that indeed the longer term global neutral rate is turned to be somewhat lower than opined 5 years earlier.
Thanks. And turning to this very risk premium for Russia, what are your views on the sanction risks now, and how much are you worried about? And what could be a potential policy response, if any, in terms of any sanction scenarios?
On that, we have a very boilerplate answer, which won't make anybody fall off their chairs. The baseline scenario on which the monetary policy decisions are based is routinely projecting the current sanctions regime into perpetuity, and we think that this is the balanced approach. In the event of any changes to the regime, the central bank, as it demonstrated on multiple occasions over the past many years, has a very broad range of the financial stability tools which it can deploy as necessary depending on the circumstances.
Thank you. And probably the one question which is probably more precise on the trajectory of the rate and your decisions, if I may, I think it's quite a difference now that unlike previous crises, the central bank set quite an anchor in terms of both neutral rate and inflation expectations, and it actually means that probably the central banks knows exactly what where it's going to end this very rate hiking cycle, and probably it's actually will. What exactly stands behind like quite a fast increase of the key rate, again, in contrast with previous crisis when the central bank preferred to move by very, very small steps. What do you think? Will this work going forward? Will the central bank will stick to its large steps or go back to the smaller steps, given like some uncertainty?
I would say that there is this formula, I think, used by the Fed maybe 3 years ago. The monetary policy is not on a preset course, right? The trajectory will be determined by the incoming information. And as I said when answering, or alluded to when answering the first question, there is clearly a larger degree of margin of error since this time around. The central banks have to take a more harder assessment of the evolution of the supply side, which usually in the short run is assumed to be fairly static. It's not the case in the current episode, and that is something which impacts the trajectory of inflation quite materially. So coming back to your point, to improve the communication, the Central Bank of Russia added to its published forecast the projected trajectory of the key rate in April forecast deck. It will be updated as usual at the core meeting on 23rd of July. At this point in time, we can only say that, and that's something which the governor said after the June non-core meeting, that at this point in time, both growth and inflation are probably tracking somewhat higher than the April forecast presumed. Again, the forecast will be revised in its entirety in July, and the April deck, as you know, showed the average level of the key rate for 2022 between 5.3 and 6.3. So there was some slight tilt upwards from the longer term neutral range, which kind of was there to reflect the possibility that to bring inflation expectations down, we may actually need to move indeed beyond 6 under certain scenarios. But it's not predetermined, of course. It will be very much determined on the incoming data.
I ask, just to interrupt with a broader question for a second. That inflation, and it may turn out to be a much bigger problem in the 2020s, we'll see. But my inclination coming into this crisis was that the next crisis like this one would push us into a more deflationary or disinflationary world. If there is a global disinflation trend in Russia, which affects Russia too in the next 5 years, such that inflation keeps on coming in under your target, do you think the central bank's response would be to favor a reduction in the inflation target, or do you think it would be to accept that the neutral rate could be lower and that central bank nominal rates might be 4% over 5 years instead of 5 or 6%? Which do you think the central bank would be inclined to suggest? To take advantage of global disinflation to cut the inflation target, or take advantage of global disinflation to cut interest rates?
Yeah, Charlie, I remember a very similar exchange exactly a year ago at this event. And at this point in time, we had indeed inflation, at least annual inflation at this time, at that time running below 4% kind of. Now we have a very different situation, right? And as we all know, all economists know, the degree of achieving the target can be judged only over medium and longer run, right? And because of the lags in the monetary policy, the way how it works. And the fact is, the arithmetic fact is, right, that from 2017 through 2020, the average annual inflation in Russia was 3.8, right? And given that it's slightly higher than that or somewhat higher than that in the first half of this year, probably it converged even closer to 4%. Once you take the window through the middle of this year. So first of all, the notion that the central bank undershot its inflation target and since it moved to the inflation target is not confirmed by the data. We are exactly on target, almost exactly on target with that respect. And of course, it's not only it's the result of many circumstances, but I think it's partly the validation that the central bank can achieve the policy target if it follows the disciplined policy, right? So there, the idea of moving the target because you can't hit it is misplaced. It just means that your monetary policy shall be calibrated better to actually achieve the target in the future.
I would take that as implying interest rate cuts would be more likely then, as if over the next 5 years.
I think I don't think we have enough time for this elaborate debate, but I think the level of the only thing which I can say is that if the central bank properly analyzes the effects of its monetary policy and has the proper view on the transmission mechanism in the economy, it can deliver 4% inflation. Whether it will require, what level of the policy rate it will require, it will depend on a lot of different factors, one of which will be the global interest rate and inflation environment, but only one of those.
Fair enough. Sophia, sorry, back to you.
Well, yeah, more or less back to medium-term expectation and forecasts. My question would be that yesterday in a discussion with a government official, we heard a view that even fiscal stimulus this time around were more of a monetary nature, both globally and in Russia, especially naming the mortgage subsidies and things like that. So what's your view? What's the role of the fiscal stance now? Are they moving to like neutral? Are they neutral already? Are they probably would they add like any problems to the transmission of the monetary policy? And what's your base assumption on the fiscal stance going forward?
I think here are several kind of related but independent questions. First, kind of the fiscal policy strategy was outlined in the autumn, and to our best knowledge, it remains unchanged. That is the convergence of the fiscal policy parameters to those prescribed by the fiscal rule in year 2022, right? So this year is the transition year, and in this transition year, the fiscal policy is not as stimulatory as it was in 2020 when we had to fill the hole created by the COVID lockdowns, but it is still stimulatory compared if you compare it to the longer term steady state, right, which is determined by the fiscal rule. Now, again, to the best of our knowledge, that strategy remains in place and is very systemically implemented. Among other things, it presumes that, as usual, any additional non-oil revenues which emerge because of the better economic outcome for the year and the higher tax proceeds from the non-oil part of the economy, they will be directed towards some supplementary budget spending, and some of those already were pre-announced by the president, right? And the government will implement those in the second half of this year. But as long as the non-oil balance remains the one which is penciled in for this year, kind of it means that the impact on the monetary policy is pretty much unchanged, and we just take the trajectory of the budget into account. But given that the economy is recovering faster and the fiscal policy is modestly stimulatory, that obviously is an extra it's an extra component of the rationale to see that there is no reason for the monetary policy to remain accommodative, and maybe kind of it shall lean towards the upper end of what is the reasonable range of neutral. So that's that's probably the message. In terms of the mortgage subsidies per se, yes, they were extended, and we definitely will take that into account when assessing the aggregate evolution of the monetary conditions. The important message from us is that the significant broadening of credit support programs definitely reduces the efficacy of the monetary policy transmission mechanism. So any large-scale credit support programs are timely and proper as anti-crisis measures, but they should be wound down when the crisis is past to let the monetary policy work for the benefit of the economy in its entirety, A, and B, to actually have those measures kind of reserved in the toolbox to deploy if necessary when the next crisis strikes, because it will inevitably happen later or sooner.
Great, thank you. I would say what my question would be, what will drive the next crisis in your view? But we also have one question from the audience, so I will start with that. The question is how the faster normalization, if happens, on developed markets, presumably in US, could influence the trajectory of the key rate decisions of the central bank, and what could happen if this faster normalization will start when the central bank already will have an elevated rate? So could this be an additional hit from this side? Thanks.
And that's an interesting line of thinking, which is quite popular, as I reckon, from many conversations. In my view, if you think about the kind of core macroeconomic logic of the core macroeconomic forecasting models, right? There are four variables: the output gap, the OI or GDP as another way to represent it, inflation, exchange rate, and the interest rate, right? And two of those are in differences, right? It's the changes in the exchange rate and the changes in the inflation. But two of them are actually in levels, which are the output gap and the interest rate, and or in the differences with the equilibrium, right? So it is answering your question. The thing which determines outcomes is not the change in the interest rate, it's the level in the interest rate, right? And if the level of the interest rate is already at the appropriate level, which is consistent with tighter global monetary stances, then kind of the actual tightening of the global monetary policy will have a rather minimal impact on the future decisions. But again, it will depend on how the things unfold and how significant are changes to the expectations about the global rate path, right?
So thank you. It's quite clear. So I think we'll have no further questions from the audience. So I would take a chance to hear your views on what could drive the next crisis globally or in Russia, and what's your thoughts on potential things the market should focus on now.
I think we have first to actually call the current crisis episode completely closed. It's unfortunately it's probably somewhat premature to say so. We see additional wave of the pandemic unfolding, and as a potential deferral. So I think that let's first get to the steady state, and then we'll think about the next crisis.
Okay, and if not crisis, then what could be like some drivers or focuses? Do we should care about ESG agenda or like boom of retail investors in Russia? What's your other focus?
No, ESG, I wouldn't say ESG is important, but I think from the standpoint of the longer term view, the whole energy transition is of much greater significance, because it will have, it might have quite profound impacts on the parameters of that longer term steady state for individual countries and sectors, and that's something which definitely attracts our attention. Again, it's not something which meaningfully affects the cyclical view on the economy for the next 2-3 years, but that's something which actually is very important when thinking about the 5-10 year macroeconomic sustainability and prudent policies. With that respect, the fiscal rule is totally cornerstone element of the longer term macroeconomic sustainability, and our working assumption is that it will be, or our strong confidence is that it will be in place to actually shield the economy from this energy transition risk. And otherwise, I think in terms of the cyclical outlook, it's the topic which you already touched upon quite extensively. It's indeed the monetary policy response functions of the global central banks. I think plus kind of and its interaction with the supply side, which is by the supply side dynamics, which is kind of again something much where the existing data is makes it harder to make an informed judgment than when you're thinking about the demand side, simply because the supply side is much more driven by the expectations than by demand, and in the hard data you don't see much kind of reasonably good estimates about the business and consumer expectations. With that respect, kind of supply side kind of is something which introduces larger, broader, which widens the confidence bands for all the policymakers.
So thank you. That's a great color and great food for thoughts and a great discussion. So thank you.
Thanks for your questions, and have a very productive conference for the 25th year.
We had a great start, so I pretty much believe that it will go smoothly. So thank you, Alexei. Thank you for your time.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Alexei.
Knowledge is information, but not all information turns into knowledge. Today, every company leaves digital footprints in hundreds of different sources. But this information by itself does not tell you who it is you're looking at and what the risks of doing business with them are. Businesses can't exist in a vacuum. They need employees, customers, partners, contractors, investors. Good counteragents help a company succeed, create products, make profit, expand business opportunities. But what about bad ones? 49% of organizations around the world say that they've been victims of fraud or economic crime. 2/3 of Russian companies say they've encountered economic crime in the past 2 years. This is significantly higher than the global average. Every year, 15% of companies simply disappear, whether on their own initiative or because they're forced to do so by tax bodies, often leaving unpaid debts. If you want to minimize your risk, you need to find and analyze every scrap of information you can, identifying, analyzing, collecting facts. Processing big data is impossible without qualified specialists, experience, time, expensive equipment, new technology, machine learning, graphs. Spark Interfax gathers information from all available sources and converts it into knowledge, allowing you to see the world of business in its entirety with all its risks and opportunities. And there's no doubt that tomorrow we'll be able to understand the world of business even better, thanks to the emerging digital economy, cutting-edge technology, and the availability of new information about the lives of companies. Knowledge decreases risks and creates trust, the foundation of any successful business. Knowledge is information, but not all information turns into knowledge. Today, every company leaves digital footprints in hundreds of different sources. But this information by itself does not tell you who it is you're looking at and what the risks of doing business with them are. Businesses can't exist in a vacuum. They need employees, customers, partners, contractors, investors. Good counteragents help a company succeed, create products, make profit, expand business opportunities. But what about bad ones? 49% of organizations around the world say that they've been victims of fraud or economic crime. 2/3 of Russian companies say they've encountered economic crime in the past 2 years. This is significantly higher than the global average. Every year, 15% of companies simply disappear, whether on their own initiative or because they're forced to do so by tax bodies, often leaving unpaid debts. If you want to minimize your risk, you need to find and analyze every scrap of information you can, identifying, analyzing, collecting facts. Processing big data is impossible without qualified specialists, experience, time, expensive equipment, new technology, machine learning, graphs. Spark Interfax gathers information from all available sources and converts it into knowledge, allowing you to see the world of business in its entirety with all its risks and opportunities. And there's no doubt that tomorrow we'll be able to understand the world of business even better, thanks to the emerging digital economy, cutting-edge technology, and the availability of new information about the lives of companies. Knowledge decreases risks and creates trust, the foundation of any successful business.
Good morning. My name is Alexander Bryansky. I'm head of oil and gas research at Renaissance Capital, and it gives me a great pleasure to welcome everybody to the second day of Renaissance Capital's 25th annual Russia conference, and specifically to today's panel discussion, Response to Climate Change. We're very fortunate to have a distinguished panel of participants to discuss the topic of climate change, which is becoming increasingly relevant for countries, companies, and investors across emerging and frontier markets. Without further delays, I would like to introduce our today's speakers. Mark Jetway, Deputy Chairman of the Management Board at Novatec, Peter O'Brien, Managing Director for Economics and Finance at Sibur, Svetlana Ivchenko, Director of Sustainable Development at Nornakil, Tatiana Mitrova, Professor, Head of Research at Skolkovo Energy Center, and Mikhail Chamolin, President, Chairman of the Board, Segezha Group. Welcome to our panel. Russia's efforts on combating the effects of climate change are governed by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that was adopted in 1992 and ratified by Russia in 1994. The first global initiative under this convention was the Kyoto Protocol, which was signed in 1997. This was replaced by the Paris Agreement in 2015. In accordance with the Paris Agreement, all participating countries have to set their own ambitious objectives with regard to climate change, including setting their own emission reduction targets for 2050. Most corporates have to do the same under various climate-related protocols and disclosure rules. While Russia has published its draft long-term strategy last year, it was supposed to be formally adopted by the end of 2020, but this is yet to happen. My first question is then to Tatiana Mitrova. What is the current status of Russia's national climate targets? When will the national strategy be adopted? And how do Russia's national climate targets compare to other countries?
Thank you, Alexander, and hello, everybody. Actually, in Russia, greenhouse gas emissions regulation is still in the very initial stage. And it is expected that in 2021, this year, the first regulatory documents will come into force. You've mentioned already the long-term goal of the Russian Federation on greenhouse gas emissions. That was actually approved already by the presidential decree number 666 in November 2020. And it sets the target of emissions of 70% from the level of 1990 to be achieved by 2030. Actually, it doesn't look as a really ambitious target because in 2017, Russian emissions, they were about 50.7% of the level of 1990. So basically, we are talking about the official target to increase emissions during this decade. It is fixed in this presidential decree, and this is official Russia's NDC submitted in the framework of the Paris Agreement by the end of the last year. Then there is this strategy of long-term development of the Russian Federation with low greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The draft regulation was already published. I think it was August last year. It has been severely criticized by the ministries, and now it is again reviewed. Hopefully, we expect it to be finalized before Glasgow, so sometime during the summer or in the fall. Both these documents, the presidential decree and the long-term strategy, they are actually not very ambitious, as I said. So the target is quite moderate. And the very regulation, there is no carbon price or carbon tax. There are no real restrictions on carbon emissions. It's more about accounting and information disclosure at this stage, which is already, by the way, a big step ahead, because preliminary we didn't have any disclosure or any regulation on all greenhouse gas emissions. So there was only a partial regulation on methane emissions. And then there is another document, which is also about disclosure and about reporting. It was actually approved by the State Duma last week on June 15 in the third reading. It is federal law on limiting greenhouse gas emissions. So it conceptually corresponds to the presidential decree. And again, no regulation is introduced as such. It is rather the framework for reporting and for a disclosure of the informations. So this is the status quo, better than nothing, but still very far away from the real greenhouse gas regulation.
Thank you for that. We'll come back to the issue of regulation a bit later. But as we just heard, Russia's national carbon reduction targets are not as ambitious as some of the other countries. Russian corporates, on the other hand, tend to show better performance on climate metrics compared to the international peers and have equally ambitious, or in some cases even more ambitious, targets. And I would like to ask our speakers to share the key elements of their climate strategies, and if possible, also discuss them in the context of their international peer group. Can we start with Novatec? Mark, please.
First, I would like to state that I do believe that Russia is doing something about climate change and has taken a proactive stance as the country adopted the tenets of the Paris Climate Agreement in September 2019, like the Kyoto Protocol in '97 and the Paris Agreement in 2015, setting unenforceable individual climate targets was never going to succeed with the various states of economic development and the concessions made to certain polluting countries. If we can start with the fundamental premise that this represents a global challenge, then we can see some hopeful prospects of an energy transition, but to assume that decarbonizing society without the use of fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, is unrealistic. We have stated many times already that our pathway to decarbonizing society is through natural gas, as we don't characterize natural gas as a transition fuel, as we talked about yesterday, but more like a bridge fuel, or, not as a bridge fuel, but more as an integral part of the future energy mix for many, many decades. We need to bring forth this debate on how best to decarbonize society in a responsible manner, rather than publishing worst case scenarios or promulgating fearmonger narratives. And I believe the recent IEA net zero emissions 2050 roadmap was heralded by the media and various green NGOs as a wake-up call to society. But instead, I believe it raised more uncertainties as to future oil and gas investments beyond 2021 and navigated a major shift towards mostly renewables. This proposition, in our opinion, is totally unrealistic and lacks any credibility. At Novatec, we published our environmental and climate change targets this past August, established in 2019 as their baseline year, and including our climate metrics through our strategy period of 2030, we felt that this period represented a realistic time frame considering our present corporate strategy, and we can be held accountable in shorter time periods rather than setting aspirational goals, like for example, to 2050 with no accountability. You know, the other thing I'd like to mention too is sustainability is not a new concept at Novatec. Interestingly, we included decarbonization and climate change in our recent strategy that we published in 2017, as sustainable development is an integral part of our overall strategic framework, and development of increasing our natural gas output, both domestically and internationally, contributes to the replacement of dirtier fuels like coal in the energy mix. In 2008, we started reporting under the carbon disclosure requirements, and in 2020, we joined the methane guiding principles as a signatory member. And in July of this upcoming month, we will publish our 14th sustainability report, which makes Novatec the longest history of sustainable reporting in the Russian oil and gas industry, which will be fully compliant with GRI and SASB standards, as well as TCFD recommendations. How do we fare against our global peers? I would say unequivocally, very favorably. Our gas mix and our production reserves profile is more than 85%. We have one of the lowest GHG emissions globally at 298 kilograms per carbon emissions per BOE versus the industry average of 352 kilograms of carbon. Our Yamal LNG project ranks second globally at 0.26 ton carbon per ton of emissions intensity versus the industry average of about 0.4. Ironically, Alexander, many of the climate targets that we have outlined recently are already lower than the climate reduction targets established by our international peers to 2035 or 2040. We're also confident that we can further reduce our carbon footprint by implementing new technologies such as CCS, using blended fuels like hydrogen, natural gas mix to run our turbines and compressors, and introducing green energy into the power source at our facilities. You know, we know that producing approximately 18.8 million tons of LNG this past year, we effectively reduced 52 million tons of coal by the coal to gas switch-in, and by 2030, we believe that producing an average of 62 million tons per annum, we can produce more than 170 million tons of carbon annually for many years. So this represents our contributions to decarbonizing, and the main reason why we advocate strongly, natural gas, because it's affordable, secure, and sustainable.
Thank you very much, Mark. Peter, can I ask you to comment on Sibur's climate strategy, please? Peter, I think you are muted.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Alex. And first, to take on your comment with respect to how we look versus peers, and I appreciate that not everybody on the phone will have had access to Sibur financial reporting information, as we only currently have public debt. But in short, we look very good versus our global petrochemical peers in terms of emission levels per EBITDA, and that's without getting any credit, if you will, for the reduction of natural gas flaring in West Siberia, which our business makes possible, the reduction of flaring. In terms of the key components of our climate strategy, I would list 5. The first being, and the most current, if you will, reduction of emissions at our existing production facilities. We're doing that through a combination of newer and more technologically advanced capacities that we've installed, investing in related infrastructure for water, waste, and other treatments, and also just better and more active monitoring and management of emissions through increased digitalization and operating systems. Secondly, we're growing the share of renewable energy sources at our facilities, especially at our newer projects. For example, at the planned Amur gas chemical complex in the Far East in the Amur Oblast, we're looking at both hydro and solar supply to that facility. We're also already established a solar capacity at our facility in southern Russia at Sibur-Yug. Third component that we highlight is we're supporting and also participating in projects in Russia to increase the natural capture of carbon. We've already announced 2 specific projects, one in Tyumen, one in Voronezh. They're both forestation related projects to develop the capability to monitor and measure consumption capacity of different trees and plants, and provide a framework, if you will, for planning and valuing such forestation projects going forward, and regulating as well. Next, I would mention industrial level carbon capture technology. This is at an earlier stage, admittedly, but we are discussing with a number of potential partners developing and eventually rolling out industrial scale carbon capture facilities. And then lastly, and I understand we'll come back to this later, Alexander, so I won't spend much time on it, is our recycling. If we're talking broadly about climate, we're obviously going to be talking about recycling, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. Just want to highlight that all of these initiatives are coming out of Sibur's ESG strategy, which is underpinned by a strong culture around ESG at Sibur for at least 5 to 7 years. For example, if you take a look at just one of our HSE indicators, which HSE indicators form over a quarter of senior management incentive compensation. And just take LTIF, we managed to reduce that by 2/3 over the past 5 years. And I think that's a good indicator of how systematic, if you will, Sibur is committed to these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pete, and we will come back to some of these issues later in this discussion. So can I ask Svetlana, please, to talk about the climate strategy for Norilsk Nickel?
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. Nornakil is committed to being a responsible supplier for the green economy, making every effort to continue reducing its carbon footprint. Nornakil's climate change strategy was announced last December as a concept with key statements, and lately we developed it, and our strategy was recently approved by the board. It was just in June, 1st of June. So we aim at 2 main goals. First is to maintain Scope 2 and Scope 1 and Scope 2 absolute GHG emissions under the Kyoto Protocol, not higher than 10 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And this goal is despite 30-40 increase in metal production we expect by 2020 compared to 2017. And the second one is to remain in the bottom quartile of the global Scope 1 and Scope 2 GHG emission intensity curve for the global nickel industry, measured in GHG emissions per ton of nickel equivalent. So furthermore, our climate change policy, due to be released soon, stipulates on key principles to respect the Paris Agreement and supporting global efforts of combating climate change. We aim to deliver on these tasks through increasing energy efficiency, exploring opportunity for renewables in our energy supply, switching to low carbon or alternative fuels, and developing partnership to support innovations. Details of the program is now under development, and as you asked to compare with our peer groups, based on year 2020 results, our relative competitive position is strong. Our Scope 2 and Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are one of the lowest absolute greenhouse gases level among our mining majors globally. And as for electricity, 46% of our electricity is generated from renewable sources. It's also a relatively high level on a global scale. So, given that, Nornakil strives to find right balance between production growth essential to boost green energy and our own decarbonization strategy, finally to ensure reliability of our operation, because our metals support to increase demand for green economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. I think green energy generation could also be an important part of Segezha Group's climate strategy. So, Mikhail, can you please talk to us about the climate strategy for your group?
Yeah, a couple of things. The biggest question, which is yet to be answered right now, is how the forests which we manage and operate, and we manage and operate them on the basis of 49-year leases from the government. So how those forests will be treated from the calculation of CO2 unit perspective. If those forests will be treated the way we believe they will be treated as a resource that we operate and manage, then we will have a positive balance of about 500,000 CO2 units at our disposal. So not only we will not have an issue of CO2 emission, but we will be able to trade those units with other companies and businesses that actually are CO2 negative and need to be compensated for the carbon tax. And we estimate that we can increase our EBITDA by about 5 billion rubles just doing so. And two things how we can kind of further enhance the carbon reduction agenda. One, which I think is the biggest, is advancing the use of wood in modern multi-story house construction. Currently, about 39% of all the CO2 emissions globally come from buildings, constructing buildings and using buildings. And from using buildings, it's about 28%, all the heat and everything involved in having people live there. And about 11% are basically CO2 emissions that go with the construction process, and mainly manufacturing concrete and cement from which concrete is made. So cement is the prime material used in multi-story construction these days. It has been proven a few years back that concrete can be replaced with a technology called CLT, or cross-laminated timber, is where large parts of building are manufactured and glued from wood. And there are examples already in Europe, Scandinavia, Australia, where buildings up to 28 stories are built from CLT. So our mission is to advance this agenda in Russia and in Europe predominantly, and try to kind of drive the construction industry towards using more and more wood as a construction material instead of concrete, that will naturally reduce the CO2 emissions generated while producing cement, and also given that wood is a renewable resource, and wood in the building continues to absorb CO2 even when it's dead wood, we get benefits from basically all sides. And besides kind of changing the construction tradition, so to say, there are no physical or technological limitations to wood being used in construction, and we are big believers that can be the case. We are the first CLT producer in Russia, and we're investing a lot in this technology. And second direction which we are taking in Russia is, together with the government, by the way, which is supporting this idea, is to use a lot of the former agricultural land in Russia that is not being used for agricultural purposes now, and turning it into a land where the forests can be harvested for use in the forestry and pulp paper industry. Essentially, in the Soviet Union, it used to be that you would have a lot of agricultural land in the middle of Russia, in the European part, also in the northern part, also in Siberia, and nowadays producing wheat in those areas makes no economic sense because of the cost, and most of the wheat production is concentrated now in the south, in Krasnodar and the Rostov region, but those huge plots of land, which on paper are agricultural land, and the government is trying to enforce the owners to either turn it back to agriculture or pay fines. They cannot do that simply because economically it doesn't work. And in the last 40 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, this agricultural land is actually covered by forest, in fact. So what we're doing, we're buying this agricultural land from the government, and we're turning into essentially harvesting plots. We can grow both softwood and hardwood for our future use and enhance the forestation agenda and the CO2 emission agenda. So those are the two kind of the wooden house construction and turning agricultural land into harvesting land are the key things that we're doing besides kind of reforestation of the forest that we use for our everyday production needs and all the kind of efficiency programs that we have in our production units to reduce CO2 emission by replacing the old technology with the latest machinery and equipment that have the CO2 reduction methods in them from the beginning.
Okay, thank you very much, Mikhail. We will come back with a discussion on what can be used to reduce the carbon emissions later in this panel. But I would like to continue first with the regulatory aspect of the climate change. Tatiana already mentioned that Russia is in the process of adoption of its new law on CO2 emissions, while the European Union is due to come up with the long-awaited proposal for its carbon border adjustment mechanism. So Tatiana, can you please talk to us about the implications of these regulations to Russian companies, and what in particular other regulatory decisions do we need to watch for and expect in the coming months?
Yeah, Alexander, this regulation, or better to say, preliminary announcement of European plans to introduce this regulation last year, they served as a wake-up call both for the Russian business and for the Russian regulators, who were far less preoccupied by this agenda before this announcement. It is still not clear how exactly this regulation will be shaped. Couple of weeks ago, there was a leakage of preliminary document, but we still do not know how the final version will look like, which is to be published on July 14th. But in the consultations with the representatives of the European Union, it is already clear that oil, gas, coal, so fuels, they will not be part of this regulation, which is a big relief for the Russian authorities, first of all, and for the Russian companies. It is primarily targeted at steel and cement makers, fertilizer producers, so other energy-intensive industries, and basically the assessments of losses which Russian exporters will face due to this regulation turned to be out not as high as people thought just a year ago, but it is only the first step of the European Union, so it's not time to relax and think that, okay, it will not create any significant damage. Basically, European Union made it very clear that it is planning to expand the number of the goods which will be included in this regulation. And obviously, we see already, even during the last year, quite an impressive growth of the ETS price of carbon, which means that this tax will increase with the time. So I think that at the end of the day, most of the Russian companies, not only exporters, but also companies working on the domestic market, in this or another way will be affected by this regulation. Of course, we are now heading to the beginning of negotiations. So European Union will publish the final version, and then there will be public discussions. There will be a period to submit proposals and different corrections to this regulation, and it seems that Russian business will be engaged in this process, and I hope that finally something more or less balanced will be achieved. But the problem is that solving this short-term threat, short-term problem, anyway, we cannot avoid a longer-term pressure, because we hear already China discussing similar regulation. No idea what will happen in the US, but basically it is obvious that earlier or later this or another way of carbon price for exporters might be introduced, and therefore Russia started also to think about the way how to introduce something similar domestically to avoid this money going to the EU budget, but rather targeting them to the Russian budget. There is an experiment which is under development right now at Sakhalin Island. They are just preparing the regulation, so it's too early to say anything about the details. But the plan is to announce this territory as achieving net zero by 2025 and to start an experiment on carbon trading. So that will be the first attempt. Hopefully it will be successful, and hopefully it will be accepted by the European side. There are so many uncertainties, but I wouldn't, Alexander, I wouldn't actually focus only on CBM. It is important, it is short-term story and discussion, but there are other types of regulation which is now under discussion in the EU, which could affect Russian companies as well. Strategy on methane emissions. The regulation should be published by the end of this year. We do not know what will be in sight so far, but it will definitely affect oil and gas companies. Then the whole European taxonomy, which defines sustainable projects and unsustainable, and the rules of for the financial sector to invest in these different types of projects. So we are just in the very beginning of this evolution of the external markets, and the only thing we can say for sure that the requests from the importers will become more and more pressuring on the Russian producers in order to decarbonize. This is the only thing that is granted.
Thank you, Tatiana. Can I continue on the subject of regulation and ask Svetlana to share the experience of Nornakil with Russia's regulatory framework on climate change?
Yes, sure. To start with, definitely this year was quite high level of activity on the side for regulator in dealing with climate change related agenda, and we actually supported these initiatives. We assess positively the action of Russian regulator related to speeding up of crucially important and long anticipated laws, such as Russian law on greenhouse gases emissions and green taxonomy by National Bank. However, we do consider that further efforts can be taken to foster establishment and launch of Russian carbon trading system and its alignment with the similar system in the European Union, China, USA. Also, more efforts can be allocated towards development of national decarbonization strategy with firm targets and action plans for at least key industries, coupled with some important initiatives underlying national climate change adaptation plan. Namely, corporate sector would benefit from downscaling of IPCC climate change scenarios on Russia and its regions, so we can use it to in our calculation toward TCFD activities. Also, we see great value for domestic businesses from development of socio-economic scenarios for Russia, also compatible with IPCC climate change scenarios, in order to improve corporate response to tackle climate change and properly meet climate change aspects in strategic planning and risk management. The company Nornakil is ready to participate in metal and mining related part of any further consultation in the mentioned areas and share experience and also insights when it comes to further development of our industry.
Thank you. Thank you, Svetlana. So one of the aspects of regulation, has to do with the growing penetration of recycling technologies. And Peter, you already mentioned recycling is an important part of Sibur's climate strategy. Is recycling a threat or an opportunity for Sibur?
Sure, thanks, Alexander. Just as a backdrop, keep in mind that we are operating in growing markets, primarily Russia, Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, with growing demand for our packaging products. And also keep in mind that our packaging material is less energy intensive over its life cycle than many other options for, say, short-term packaging for food and other products. So we definitely see it as an opportunity to, recycling as an opportunity to grow our business, both through mechanical recycling and undoubtedly, but eventually also chemical recycling. On mechanical recycling, we've already launched our first production project at our polyeth facility in Blagoveshchensk, which is in Bashkiria, where we intend to launch production next year. We've already started to build the facility, launch production next year of our green PET granules. This will contain about 1/4 of recycled material. And we intend to grow this business in sync with recycling practices developing in Russia and the related market for recycled plastic becoming more developed in Russia. In terms of chemical recycling, it's definitely an R&D priority for us and should provide some real options, but probably only within 3 to 5 years. But when we do have those options, they should be more efficient than mechanical recycling, and they will help to further reduce CO2 emissions. So we are prioritizing those, but see those further out.
Thank you. It's interesting you mentioned green PET. It's inevitable that the outcome of the climate change will translate into the emergence of new green products. There's green aluminum already in existence, green oil, green gas, etc. And Novatec in particular has started marketing green LNG to its customers. So Mark, can you please share with us the experience that you see for green LNG? What kind of demand growth do you see? How big this business can become for Novatec, and how different are the marketing channels for green versus traditional LNG?
Yeah, that's correct, Alexander. But I think before I get onto that specifically, I just want to follow up on the comment Tatiana made in relation to the regulations. I think sometimes it's often overlooked that Russia pipeline gas for the last 50 plus years contributed over 5 trillion cubic meters of natural gas to the European Union, has allowed the European Union to decarbonize and move away from about 46%, coal usage to about 15%. So I think when the regulators start making these decisions, they also ought to look that Russia has been a large contributor to the decarbonization process in EU already and will contribute. And I think that same agenda is also being played out, whether you look at LNG or pipeline gas, et cetera, going into the Asian Pacific market. China is a good example as we move away from coal to natural gas. But yeah, you're right. Green LNG is still developing. If we look at the total trade in the LNG markets, I think green transactions were only about 10. And one of the ones that came out of Russia, Gazprom to Shell, was actually sourced from our Yamal LNG product. So it's a way for us to go in as we control the whole value chain from upstream to liquefaction to shipping, et cetera. We understand the scope 1, scope 2 elements. So we're able to participate in these green tenders that we see in the marketplace. But how we categorize it, I think it's good to look at, we try to look at the hierarchy of green options. Okay, so if you look at that, saying at the lowest level of options, you look at, say, carbon offsets. And that's when somebody goes out, and what you're really asking somebody to do is mitigate your carbon emissions. So you're not doing anything yourself, you're asking somebody else to take that responsibility. And I actually think we're going to start seeing pushbacks from governments that are going to say that is not acceptable as the only solution. So then as you start going up the hierarchy, it becomes much more difficult, because then you have to take a more proactive approach to carbon abatement or carbon mitigation. And like I said earlier, some of the things that we're looking at is on a carbon capture and storage option, where we have gone on, say for Yamal LNG, we have identified subsurfaces that we can work in. We know the number of injection wells, but this is an area when we talk about regulations, is Russia doesn't really have a regulation in place today for carbon injection. So we have to work on that. So we just can't go and do it. We have to make sure that it's in compliance with Russian law. And so we're actually working now, and we hope that by 2022, we can take an FID decision, a final investment decision, to move forward with that type of project. In terms of the size, I mean, one of the things as we go up the hierarchy again, and we get to the very top, the very top of the hierarchy says no more fossil fuels. And as I alluded in my opening comments, we believe that's totally unrealistic, but that is something that the green movement would love to see, and some NGOs, et cetera, want. But again, with the economic development that we see, 2 billion more people coming on the planet Earth by 2050, GDP doubling, the only way you can really get economic prosperity and improve the standard of living of individuals is through the use of energy, more energy, not less energy. So if we look at 2040 as a number, you want to talk about the size of the market, we're thinking that LNG will double by 2040 to about 700 plus MBTAs on an annual basis. So that could be the size, because our opinion is that all LNG will be green LNG. So that moniker of calling it specifically, where maybe individual customers today are willing to pay a premium, although we're not seeing a lot of that, but they'll be willing to pay a premium, that's going to all go away. And every LNG cargo that being delivered in some form or manner will have to be decarbonized, so nobody will call it green LNG. By controlling the value chain, one of the things that we have the advantage over, say, our US LNG competitors. US LNG competitors, which are basically on a tolling arrangement model, where they buy gas from various sources, they have to go upstream to try to determine whether or not the producer has met the requirement, whether it's fracking, flaring, et cetera, and they have to receive certifications from that element. So one of the most important things that we look at today is this whole concept on monitoring, verifying, and reporting. And that's a sticky question today, where we're seeing a lot of companies that are trying to work. And that's part of the reason why, the methane guiding principles group that we talked about, we're working on it, because in the industry today, the biggest leak is not CO2, the biggest leak is methane. And that is something that we can tackle more effectively as an industry, rather than carbon. Because if you listen to some of the policy, without carbon, we don't get photosynthesis. Without photosynthesis, we don't get plant life. And so to be able to say that we want to remove carbon, which is only one element in a multi-complex system of climate, is kind of ludicrous that you can control that. But even, again, one of the things that makes it really interesting too is that if we look at the carbon question, right, the industry generates about 13% roughly, maybe up to 15% of the carbon. So that means 80 to 85% plus is done on the combustion side, right? So when we go scope 1, scope 2, it's easy. So to get to the scope 3 level, which we'll report in our upcoming sustainability report in July, you have to work downstream. And that's where, like Peter and everybody was talking about, Norilsk with their power. So you're working with our customers downstream to try to green their processes so that we can also include as part of our, scope 3 requirements. But just give you an example, on a cargo of LNG today, so-called green that's on the market, if we use ARC7s, 170,000 cubic meters, if we looked at a average of $7 to $10 carbon cost per ton, that equates to about $1.5 to $2 million per cargo, right? Or roughly 50 to 80 cents per MMBTU to deliver. So somebody's going to have to pay it. So the question is, how do we split? Is it going to be 25% that the producer pays, 75% that the consumer pays? And that question still remains to be answered. And I think this, touch on it, the same question we had a carbon tax. Who's ultimately going to pay for it, right? It's going to, the industry is pushing for the consumer market to absorb a large portion of this process. So I think these are the things that we need to settle first before this question gets solved. But I think in terms of size and scale, everything will be green LNG, and we can look at volumes at least 700 million tons plus by 2040.
Thank you very much, Mark. Mikhail, can I ask you about the market environment for the green paper products and packaging? What are the opportunities there for Sergeja Group?
What exactly is the question? Opportunities in what?
In green paper products and packaging. So we spoke about the green products, so the low carbon intensity products. So what is the market situation there?
Well, I mean, the process of producing paper in the modern pulp and paper mills involves burning part of the raw material. Roughly, for 1 ton of pulp, you need about 5 cubic meters of wood, out of which 1 ton or 1 cubic meter is fiber, and 4 cubic meters is organic part of the wood, which is being burned in large so-called recovery boilers, and this energy is used to actually fuel and support the entire pulp mill, and also part of energy is being sold outside. So it's not only satisfying. So it's not only a plant to produce the pulp, but also an electrical plant, if you want. And from that perspective, I don't think that the process of producing paper is going to change in any close future. It will remain the same, and some CO2 emissions will inevitably be generated by producing paper. As far as all the other lines of products that we have, for example, like sawnwood, glulam, CLT production, plywood, and others, they require nothing more than electric energy, and then it's a question of where this electric energy comes from. And in Russia, it could come from hydro power stations, which are kind of CO2 neutral, nuclear power stations, which we have plenty of in Russia, and nuclear is actually one of the ways. As far as I know, actually, the only technology available at this point, we can economically produce energy without generating CO2. So I expect this to be developed further in Russia. But I think the key part is that the raw material that we use, which is wood, is a renewable material, and we have an obligation to regrow pretty much everything that we cut. And what I was talking about before with using the agricultural land for plantation and reforestation, we actually intend to generate a lot more CO2 consumption rather than production. And paper packaging is considered to be kind of a green alternative to other kinds of packaging because of the ease of utilization and less damage to water, which does not immediately transfer into reduction of CO2, but nevertheless contributes to the overall green agenda. About 83% of the forests under our management are so-called FSC certified. It's a special international agency that comes in and checks on the regular basis whether we are operating those forests responsibly, whether we do the reforestation as we have to, what kind of equipment and machinery we use, whether this machinery produces CO2, whether it's new and in good condition, and how the people work, and so on and so forth. So I think kind of overall, Sigeja Group, as I said, is CO2 negative, not positive. So we kind of generate or create more of the CO2 consumption capability than production capability. So from that perspective, all of our products can be and are considered to be green products.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Climate change also brings risks, and Norilsk nickel experienced its firsthand with the recent spill of 20,000 tons of diesel fuel in the Arctic. Svetlana, what conclusions have you drawn from this event, and how can you minimize such risks in the future?
Yes, last year example has demonstrated to us that more efforts is due to be committed toward understanding climate change and risk in the regions of our operation. Definitely deep fundamental and applied research into climate change trends in Arctic need to be done. For that, in 2020, Nornakil established cooperation with 30 scientists from 14 research institutes and conducted Great Norilsk expedition that conducted scientific work on Norilsk region, including distribution and dynamic of cryogenic processes. Nornakil has begun development of a satellite permafrost monitoring system to ensure geotechnical safety of buildings and structures in our Polog division. The pilot commissioning of the system is scheduled for late 2021, early 2022, and we hope that the system would allow us to only detect possible deformations once it matures. Additionally, company invested in upgrade of diagnostic center of Polog division and Permafrost laboratory to allow use of new monitoring devices. Well, and I have to reiterate that tackling climate change and devising proper instruments for risk management requires significant investment toward fundamental research of Arctic. And we hope that the company's first steps to devise better instruments for climate-related risk management will be also supported by broader efforts on the country level as well.
Thank you, Svetlana. Can I address a similar question to Mark? Novatec has major production facilities in the Arctic. So, Mark, can you talk to us how Novatec manages the climate risk?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we had to answer many questions this past year relating to the Norilsk spill, as you alluded to, and I think it got investors focused more on what companies are doing in the Arctic zone. And so I just like to say, we've been operating in the Arctic zone for more than 25 years. All of our core operations are pretty much above the polar circle. And so we take a proactive approach to sort of climate risk mitigation. And for example, I could say like at Yamal LNG, we drilled stairwell individual pilings, and all the facilities are basically above the permafrost that have thermal stabilizers there. And we monitor that on real-time basis with our office, our scientific research center in Tumen, who relays it back and forth between the operational people in Yamal at Sabeta. So we can actually see any changes in movement and in temperature, and then make the appropriate adjustments based on these thermal stabilizers. The other thing that we've done too, that I think is very important, is that at the planning stage, it's almost like the concept of design by green, if you understand. I mean, from the very beginning, and I think this is where the changes as these debates go on are going to impact future projects, because the people are going to have to take into consideration this whole concept of the green movement into the design process. So when we were building Yamal, one of the things we did, we looked at permafrost sensitivity analysis through the engineering process, and we looked at changes in ambient temperatures of 2 to 4 degrees. We looked at soil temperature changes of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, and we stress test these numbers to see if it had any movement or possibility to potential risk for us. And based on the stress analysis and the temperature climate that we've seen over a relatively long period of time, we felt that we can withstand any of these temperature changes given the way that the plan has been designed. Going to our next project, because as we're moving into Arctic LNG 2, we decided to deploy a whole different concept. I mean, so what we decided from Yamal, which was built onshore, to the Arctic LNG 2 project, which is built on these gravity-based structures, which are the self-contained, LNG units at 6.6 million tons per annum. And these units will be moored in the Ob River, and they're built to not be on the permafrost. So by moving it into the Ob River, we essentially only have essential operations, field development, some administrative building, the new airport landing strip that we just launched last week up there. And so what this has done, Alexander, this reduced the environmental footprint on a per unit basis about a quarter of the size. So each GBS, which is a fully contained 6.6 million ton unit, represents a quarter of what it would have been built if we did it onshore. And so that's some of the things that we've done to mitigate risk. And then I think finally, I like to say, is all our equipment is brand new. I mean, one of the things about Novatec that distinguishes from the privatization process, we didn't acquire anything from the old Soviet legacy assets. So everything was built brand new with new technologies, et cetera. And I think that helps us in implementing the latest technologies that you can deploy given the period of time where we're developing. So I think that's also a benefit from us, is not the inherence of old Soviet legacy equipment.
Thank you very much, Mark. We have probably around 10 minutes left for this discussion. And so I want to spend it talking to maybe some of you about the carbon reduction strategies that could be used in Russia. And can I please start with Sibur? Sibur already leads many of its peers on the metrics of carbon emission intensity, but I know that the company has plans to improve further. So Peter, can you please talk to us about the opportunities for carbon reduction that you see in Sibur?
Sure, Alexander. At the risk of maybe repeating myself, because I mentioned a few of them at the beginning, but happy to proceed. I think first, it's fair to say we're exploring all options and their viability, both in the near term, having an immediate or soon to be impact, and of course, longer term potential opportunities and technologies. But if we start with the near term, the priorities are, as I mentioned, reduction of emissions at existing facilities, some of which, like Mark just mentioned, are quite new. So that's new capacities with new technologies and better monitoring systems, and making real investments when it comes to emissions, both air and water or waste. Secondly, further deployment of green electricity, solar power, and hydro supply, also possibly for our Amur gas chemical complex, or other projects that can be supplied through the grid efficiently via hydro. Another is the forest projects, forestation-related projects that I mentioned, the two that we have in Tyumen and Voronezh. And again, those are pretty early stage, but we're encouraged by the level of enthusiasm of regional governments in exploring this and developing the ability to understand what these projects can actually contribute and how to monitor them, measure them, and eventually contribute them into the regulation discussion that's happening. And then last, carbon capture opportunities at our existing sites. Again, I just want to mention that, you know, we are a growing company with growing demand for our products in our main markets, Asia and Russia. And if we think longer term, and we think about our more broadly ESG strategy, which was approved last year, we are thinking about carbon reduction and what type of, and I go back to one of Mark's comments at the beginning of this call, not necessarily promising something that's fairly vague in 2050, or seems like not detailed enough, if you will, supported by details. We are thinking about updating our own strategy. We will be announcing an update to our strategy before the end of this year. And one of the things we're really trying to get to is finding a path to carbon neutral growth for Sibor.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. As we're drawing to the end of this discussion, I just wanted to ask Mark one more question. Novatec recently announced quite a large number of cooperation agreements on decarbonization with Severstal, Total Energies, Siemens, Baker Hughes. So what, can you just talk briefly what those agreements mean for Novatec and what carbon reduction opportunities you see there for the company?
Well, I think it's in line with what we've been discussing throughout the session today. It's you know, they're at still very early stages of study, but you know, like I mentioned, the carbon capture project with Yamal, with Baker Hughes and Siemens. We're looking at the fuel mix project, a hydrogen fuel mix for turbines and compressors, which will allow us to reduce our carbon footprint. We made the announcement with Fordham. It's like, you know, Peter just mentioned buying cleaner energy from the grid. And so if we can introduce, you know, into this a scope 2 by demonstrating that we can buy, you know, solar or wind power energy, it reduces our carbon footprint. Continue introducing, you know, solar panels on the, you know, domestic, you know, infill pipeline structures that we already use, but just extend that. Possibly look at small scale wind farm up in Yamal, you know, to power some of our own operations. What we've done already in terms of, you know, one of the announcements we made recently was a move away from Opsky LNG to Opsky gas chemistry, which will be then a plant that produces clean fuels like ammonia, hydrogen, and methanol. You know, we also talk about one of the things we're working on is the ships, you know, going through the Northern Sea route. By just going through the Northern Sea route, we reduce our distance, you know, like I said, by 40%, and that reduces our carbon footprint. And I think the other thing that I think sometimes people miss about Novatec is, you know, we have large, medium, and small scale LNG. And one of the things that I want to just mention on the small scale LNG is we're working to build out a network of fueling stations inside of Russia and in the EU that basically transfers the heavy trucks and modal transportation to LNG or compressed natural gas. And so we've already built out a system where we're going to connect the Northwest Russia through the Urals mountain with this plant that we built in Magnitogorsk, as well as we, you know, by the end of this year, I think we'll be the largest supplier of carbon neutral, you know, sort of LNG gas in Germany as part of the refueling process. So we're taking these small steps. I know they're incremental, But this is what we're talking about in terms of decarbonization. It has to take, you can't have these big grandiose plans. You have to take these small concrete steps, and that will lead and that will build onto one another, and that will help us reduce our carbon footprint. So that's some of the things that we're doing, Alexander.
Thank you very much, Mark. So we already spent slightly more than 1 hour discussing a variety of aspects related to climate change, including regulation, technologies, climate risk, and product innovation. As we come to an end of this panel discussion, I want to address my final question to Tatiana Mitrova. Where do you see the biggest challenge for Russia in the area of climate change, and how long do you think it will take to transform the Russian economy to fit into the low carbon world?
Thank you, Alexander. There are always challenges and opportunities. And in this particular case, I think that Russia has actually more opportunities rather than challenges in this situation of global green transition and how to fit into this global green transition. The only really big challenge is that regulators might be too slow to create a proper framework domestically to support the attempts of the business to decarbonize. You saw today that basically in different industries, large business is already going ahead, is already developing different decarbonization projects. But as Mark mentioned, for example, on CCUS, it cannot be implemented without proper regulation. The same on reforestation, on renewables, and so on. So the lack of proper regulatory framework, this is the major danger, both domestically and internationally, because the second big problem which could occur, I hope it won't, is the compatibility of Russian regulation with the EU or Chinese or US regulations, so that, for example, Russian green certificates would be accepted by the Europeans, offsets which are produced domestically are accepted by the importers, and so on. So this compatibility of different regulatory frameworks, it will require endless dialogue between Russian regulators and foreign regulators, which is sometimes difficult due to the geopolitical reasons. But I hope that in this desire to combat climate change, they will find a common language. At the same time, as I've mentioned, there are numerous opportunities. Actually, Russia is very well positioned historically, geographically, blessed by God with all these resources to be a very important player in green transformation. It is #1 in wind and solar potential in the world. Surprise, surprise, but it's the fact. It has enormous potential on carbon capture and storage. Yeah, all these depleted oil and gas fields, they could really store huge amounts of carbon. It has fantastic opportunities for reforestation and other natural sinks management. And actually, probably the biggest and the lowest hanging fruit, which was not actually discussed today, it is energy efficiency. So we are among the most energy intensive countries in the world, and with minimal efforts, with really very short term and small investments, Russia could reduce its energy intensity and its carbon intensity by 30%, which is a lot. Methane emissions reduction, which is, again, it is just a good housekeeping, as Mark mentioned. It's not a rocket science. It could also allow for very fast and significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions domestically. And I would completely echo what Mark was saying about decarbonization of oil and gas, green oil, green gas. This is the trend where Russia could become a trendsetter. It has already, most of the Russian oil and gas companies have much lower carbon footprint than their international peers. And with quite cheap, minimal efforts, they can become the world leaders. So I would agree that there is plenty of the global demand for energy will be growing, and there is definitely a room for decarbonized molecules, decarbonized gases, low carbon or completely decarbonized oil. And I think Russia could really take a significant part of this niche. So all in all, I would say it seems to be quite positive, and the most positive part is what we've heard today, the activities that companies are doing in their everyday routine already. It's not just something aside to demonstrate to the investors, it's really becoming everyday life and everyday effort. So I'll stop on that.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. I think that's a great point on which to finish this panel discussion. There's more opportunities than challenges for Russia and for the Russian oil companies. All that is left for me to do is to thank our audience for listening to this panel discussion, and to thank the participants for the available remarks. Tatiana, Svetlana, Mark, Peter, and Mikhail, thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, Alexander. Bye-bye.
Knowledge is information, but not all information turns into knowledge. Today, every company leaves digital footprints in hundreds of different sources. But this information by itself does not tell you who it is you're looking at and what the risks of doing business with them are. Businesses can't exist in a vacuum. They need employees, customers, partners, contractors, investors. Good counteragents help a company succeed, create products, make profit, expand business opportunities. But what about bad ones? 49% of organizations around the world say that they've been victims of fraud or economic crime. 2/3 of Russian companies say they've encountered economic crime in the past 2 years. This is significantly higher than the global average. Every year, 15% of companies simply disappear, whether on their own initiative or because they're forced to do so by tax bodies, often leaving unpaid debts. If you want to minimize your risk, you need to find and analyze every scrap of information you can, identifying, analyzing, collecting facts. Processing big data is impossible without qualified specialists, experience, time, expensive equipment, new technology, machine learning, graphs. Spark Interfax gathers information from all available sources and converts it into knowledge, allowing you to see the world of business in its entirety with all its risks and opportunities. And there's no doubt that tomorrow we'll be able to understand the world of business even better, thanks to the emerging digital economy, cutting-edge technology, and the availability of new information about the lives of companies. Knowledge decreases risks and creates trust, the foundation of any successful business. Knowledge is information, but not all information turns into knowledge. Today, every company leaves digital footprints in hundreds of different sources. But this information by itself does not tell you who it is you're looking at and what the risks of doing business with them are. Businesses can't exist in a vacuum. They need employees, customers, partners, contractors, investors. Good counteragents help a company succeed, create products, make profit, expand business opportunities. But what about bad ones? 49% of organizations around the world say that they've been victims of fraud or economic crime. 2/3 of Russian companies say they've encountered economic crime in the past 2 years. This is significantly higher than the global average. Every year, 15% of companies simply disappear, whether on their own initiative or because they're forced to do so by tax bodies, often leaving unpaid debts. If you want to minimize your risk, you need to find and analyze every scrap of information you can, identifying, analyzing, collecting facts. Processing big data is impossible without qualified specialists, experience, time, expensive equipment, new technology, machine learning, graphs. Spark Interfax gathers information from all available sources and converts it into knowledge, allowing you to see the world of business in its entirety with all its risks and opportunities. And there's no doubt that tomorrow we'll be able to understand the world of business even better, thanks to the emerging digital economy, cutting-edge technology, and the availability of new information about the lives of companies. Knowledge decreases risks and creates trust, the foundation of any successful business. Knowledge is information, but not all information turns into knowledge. Today, every company leaves digital footprints in hundreds of different sources. But this information by itself does not tell you who it is you're looking at and what the risks of doing business with them are. Businesses can't exist in a vacuum. They need employees, customers, partners, contractors, investors. Good counteragents help a company succeed, create products, make profit, expand business opportunities. But what about bad ones? 49% of organizations around the world say that they've been victims of fraud or economic crime. 2/3 of Russian companies say they've encountered economic crime in the past 2 years. This is significantly higher than the global average. Every year, 15% of companies simply disappear, whether on their own initiative or because they're forced to do so by tax bodies, often leaving unpaid debts. If you want to minimize your risk, you need to find and analyze every scrap of information you can, identifying, analyzing, collecting facts. Processing big data is impossible without qualified specialists, experience, time, expensive equipment, new technology, machine learning, graphs. Spark Interfax gathers information from all available sources and converts it into knowledge, allowing you to see the world of business in its entirety with all its risks and opportunities. And there's no doubt that tomorrow we'll be able to understand the world of business even better, thanks to the emerging digital economy, cutting-edge technology, and the availability of new information about the lives of companies. Knowledge decreases risks and creates trust, the foundation of any successful business.
Dan?
Good afternoon. I'm Daniel Salter, Head of Research at Renaissance Capital, and I'm accompanied by Charles Robertson, Global Chief Economist. We're delighted to welcome to our 25th Annual Russian Investment Conference, Sergei Ryabkov, Russia's Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs. Minister Ryabkov has a very wide brief, responsible for bilateral relations between with North and South America, non-proliferation and arms control, Iran's nuclear program, and Russia's participation in the BRICS Association. He has many decades of experience in foreign policy and beyond. This is not his first time at our conference speaking to investors, and we've always been very, very appreciative of his views and thoughts. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today, Minister.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you here. Now, I'd like to kick off with the US relationship. Our sense coming out of the recent summit between the Russian and US presidents is that the US seems to be willing to put the past behind it to an extent and to move forward with the relationship with Russia. Do you agree with that assessment? And what do you see as the key takeaways from that summit?
Thanks a lot. This is the core question, of course. I hope I would be able to say, yes, this is the case. I'm not in a position to do so as of now. The summit itself transpired in a way that it was possible to achieve some considerable deliverables, especially against the background of a very miserable stance this relationship is in due to several circumstances, mostly due to the very flawed view of Russia in the US and in some other parts of the world. But deliverables were there, not just in the area of strategic stability and cyber, but also in terms of leaders confirming their intention to put behind some of the most weird and unnecessary problems with diplomatic presences in respective capitals, and also agreeing to bring back ambassadors to their places of service. This is very limited in terms of what might be the actual breakthrough in relationship. The tone was businesslike, down to earth, a very pragmatic one in my view, which was good. The leaders were able to send their messages out after the summit in a way that helped, I think, to preserve the core of deliverables. But to your question, it would require several months from now, in my view, to say with a sufficient degree of certainty if at all this summit made a difference in broad sense of the word.
So you've long been a proponent, I've looked at several of your speeches, of a kind of small steps approach to the bilateral agenda with the US. I mean, where do you think the easiest areas of cooperation are right now? And do you think what we have is sufficient to build from? How should we measure the success in 6 or 12 months? What should we look at to see whether it does seem to be working?
You're exactly right. I am a very strong proponent of small steps approach. We should understate but over-deliver in an ideal world. Otherwise, it would be, once again, yet another circle of mutual disappointment. I don't believe in any ideas like, reset, détente, all the words that, point to some ideas of grandeur character are out of date today, for sure. As our relationship between Moscow and Washington kind of oscillated over the years, ups and downs, the magnitude of this oscillation became dangerously huge in recent years. So we need to do something about prevention of dangerous military activity, de-escalation, avoidance of dangerous incidents. Those are areas of prior focus, and very recently, well, I would say before the summit, still it was close to the summit, we had a regular meeting of military experts talking on the implementation of bilateral agreement dated back to 1972 on avoidance of such incidents. And Russia strongly favors improvement of this agreement and modernizing this agreement. We call our US colleagues to be serious about it. This is just an example of what should be done. In the very opposite side of this span of problems, I would say we have a number of very resound humanitarian cases where some names of the people resonate badly in general public, both in US and Russia. We should do something about it. And Russia has made its proposals known to the US side on what to do. Cyber and ICT security might be an area of obvious interest and the need for our two countries to engage proactively into. But because of extremely politicized character of some issues associated with this, I wouldn't say that it is a small step kind of area, an area prone to the small step approach. Rather, it's a quite demanding and challenging area for our effort. So improvement of the operation circumstances, operational environment of our embassies and consulate generals, improvement in the area of visa issuance where we do not have any movement whatsoever. We have half dozen of issues that may constitute this small step agenda, and we favor this. We want to follow up the summit with the bilateral consultations at the level of experts and senior officials as well, sooner rather than later, in anticipation that instructions would be implemented and the initial steps would be followed by something that may be more impressive compared to what we have right now.
If I could jump in on the issue of the cyber crime, from our angle and in terms of what our investors care about, they hate being taken by surprise. The sanctions that we got some months ago which had dated back for a number of years over a number of issues. That wasn't a great surprise to the investor community. But when we get this cyber attack, and I don't think the US government is blaming the Russian government, but is thinking it's private sector criminal gangs perhaps operating in Russia, that represents a negative surprise, which makes it hard for investors to price. You know, how bad could relationships get over issues like this? Or the question I'd put to you is, what can Russia do to try and make America feel less worried about it, to try and improve relations on the two sides on the cybercrime issue? I'm not saying it is all one way, by the way. I'm just saying, you know, in terms of stress from the US acting towards Russia, what can Russia do on that issue?
Well, investors make their own choices. It goes without saying that they calculate in a way that is very different from the way how governments and politicians do the same. And I have full respect with it. From my perspective, we have been able to establish a very thorough and down-to-earth exchange with the US side on these issues, and one of the major areas where the leaders were able to talk in a way that opens up for possible further communication and hopefully also interaction. This happened exactly in Geneva, which was an important element of the overall picture created there. We are in no way rejecting the severity of the problems that may have a relation to criminal activities in this area. We do not think that there might be such thing as impunity with respect to individuals that may eventually perform such actions. Having said that, I would also need to say immediately with the same token that the only way to achieve it is through proper bilateral cooperation with due involvement of all the agencies from both sides. Otherwise, it will end up as it usually ends in our interaction with the US on many issues. That is, US claims something, gives no evidence to support this, and it just fades out. That would be very unfortunate and very troubling. The US side gave the Russian side at this summit a list of different elements of both infrastructure and broader social fabric that, in the view of the US, require particular vigilance in terms of non-acceptance by the US side of any malign cyber activities, and we take this very seriously. But likewise, we want from the US to be serious about our complaints. I would hate to produce the litany of complaints here before you, and that's not the point, that's not the purpose. But just the fact of the matter is that the US usually doesn't respond to any of the Russian requests to provide some information on possible malicious cyber activities on Russia, Russian entities and Russian individuals. We have dozens of such cases last year alone, and it was very, very few of them that were responded to by the US. This should be improved. Another aspect of it is, with all the importance the US side attaches to the criminal activity of this in this cyber domain, we would definitely stay very firm on the idea that the dialogue should be broader than that. We should talk on other aspects of ICT securities. We should talk on issues how our respective military doctrines, as they evolve, cover this area, because we saw in recent years in the US tendencies towards, covering the cyber ground, ICT related ground, as a fighting field, as an area where offensive operations of military character are allowed. And in recent days, we saw such signals coming out from Washington already after the summit was over. All this is troubling, and we need to cover full spectrum of issues, exactly as Putin proposed to the US side when he issued his statement of September 29 last year.
Yeah, I'm very interested in this theme about rebuilding communications and understanding between Russia and different countries. And, you mentioned earlier the idea about visas and could it become easier for people to visit Russia and for Russians to visit other countries. I mean, certainly at the moment, it's quite difficult for Russians to get visas to the US, and vice versa. In fact, it's quite an administrative process. Russia, I know, has a very strong focus at the moment on developing its tourism business. At the moment, that focus is domestically because it's quite difficult for people to travel internationally, given the restrictions. But as the world reopens, might Russia choose to help diversify its economy by promoting a more liberal tourism visa regime, or does it only react to others moving at the same time? So is this a bilateral thing, or could Russia unilaterally make it more easy for people to visit?
It's both. It's both, very truly so. We had excellent experience of something that was quite unique. In recent years, we have introduced almost a visa-free entry into Russia through the arrangement which is widely known as a soccer fan pass. At the World Cup in 2018, we had dozens of thousands of people coming to the country on this. We have several areas in Russia where people coming, for instance, on cruise ships, are allowed to enter the country, and even in case of St. Petersburg, to travel to Moscow for one night stay in Moscow or something, through issuance of electronic visas for them, which is an easy arrangement and quite cheap, I would say. This is one thing. Another one is that we gradually move towards the establishment of bilateral visa-free travel arrangements for 90 days with a number of countries around, and this number grows. And since I'm doing formally our relations with Latin America, with South America, I cannot but mention that almost whole of this huge, vast region, including South America, Central America, and much of the Caribbean, is now a visa-free travel area for Russian citizens and vice versa. Wow. Of course, if people come to Russia to take the job, to stay here for studies, for getting education and other things, there are different arrangements in this area. And some say they're quite cumbersome. Others say that, the room for improvement is not exhausted, but they are quite understandable ones. We measure the requirements of different sort, including the requirements to protect the labor market in a way that improves possibilities for the locals to take jobs, and also to draw expats that are, because of their professions, because of their education and their experience, that they could, be very welcome at different positions in our economy and elsewhere in infrastructure, to draw them to the Russian market and bring them to Russia. And this is a delicate balancing act which the government tries to figure out how to resolve. I'm sure you are very aware that the Foreign Ministry, as a governmental agency, is among those who promote visa-free travel and further facilitation of visa requirements and other other requirements in this area, and we intend to do so. We will work further to move things down this road as epidemiological situation allows and as situation improves altogether in international travel in general.
That would be great. I lived for 10 years in Moscow, and I can say that one night visa-free in Moscow is probably not enough. You could spend many months exploring Moscow and, of course, Russia as a whole. Charlie.
Yeah, I've been. I was watching the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, and what struck me out of those speeches was the shift on the environment that I've seen over the last few years in Russia's thinking. It was an issue that wasn't talked about often 5 years ago, but it felt like it was a very significant part of the agenda. And you've got the COP26 summit later this year. I was just, as you were in charge of the BRICS kind of cooperation, among the things I was looking at was this issue of forests and investment into forestry and agriculture, which I imagine Brazil would probably be thinking about as well. And I wondered about whether China could be playing a role in that investment into the environmental space in terms of forests and agriculture investments in Russia. But I was just wondering, are you going to be taking a common agenda with the BRICS, with Brazil in particular, on this forest issue to that summit in Glasgow and saying we should be thinking about carbon absorption, we need to be thinking about forests and what they can do to reduce climate change risks? Is that something you're working with these other countries on? And what is Russia's, I mean, I guess it'd be lovely to hear from you about how you see the agenda on the environmental side.
Indeed, let me say something different at first instance, though. When Putin spoke at the first major VCR event arranged by the US upon arrival of President Biden, he made some very significant statements, both in terms of political observations, but also of a very specific character in terms of committing Russia to some goals which are, I would say, in sync with quite ambitious agendas that UK, European Union, US itself produces and follows. Our presidential special envoy on climate changes, Mr. Edelgiriyev, was able to communicate directly with Secretary Kerry in his new capacity. And I am sure this interaction will continue as we move closer forward to the event of the year, which is the Glasgow Global Conference on Climate Change in November. I switch now into BRICS. I would tell you that over years, an environmental agenda at BRICS gains more and more attention and also more and more importance, both in terms of, I would say, megabytes of final communiques and deliberations covering this issue, but more important of this agenda becoming more sophisticated and more complex and comprehensive, if you wish. Speaking specifically on forests, I do recognize that this is an area which draws a lot of attention because of particular nuances which we all know in particular places. But nonetheless, the role of forests in carbon sinking and in overall attitudes of the international community to the need to exhaust all the opportunities before us in order to make sure that we stay within the limits as agreed and as spelled out internationally. This is before us as an area of prior focus. I think that the Brazilian government over years, or Brazilian governments over years, were at the driving seat at BRICS in terms of developing environmental agendas. Coming back to the years where they were specifically focused on biofuel and changes of particular aspects of agricultural production into, switch over to alternatives to the standard old-fashioned hydrocarbons. Now it's somewhat different, and it's all about renewables. And Russia here stands for a very thoughtful and deliberate approach to the proper mix between hydrocarbons and renewables, where we do not think it would be right just to brush off nuclear or hydro or other areas where Russia traditionally was a strong player and still is. So BRICS is within all these areas, and I'm sure later this year, when we will see the next BRICS summit this year under the Indian chairship, further additional commitments of a multilateral, pentalateral rather, character will come up. Otherwise, it would not be possible to maintain the relevance which BRICS was able to acquire within a historically very short period of time. Remember, it's no more than 12 years old, this association. And everyone within BRICS is interested in both maintenance of the grouping, but also expansion of the scope in which this grouping is active. Some people say that there are growing difficulties and differences within BRICS, and I wouldn't underestimate the need for us at BRICS to focusedly work on some of those, and I am very sure that with the necessary political will invested into it, we would be very able and capable to put those behind. And BRICS, and this is the strongest aspect about BRICS, is never contra anything. It's always a pro approach on everything. There is no such thing as a hidden agenda in BRICS, and Russia, working through 2 cycles of its chairship already, managed, in my view, to show that we have here an inviting set of procedural approaches, but also agenda that is modern and thoroughly thought through. So BRICS doesn't require further advertisement. The very scope of activities in all 3 major areas where BRICS is growing and is known for speak for itself.
I was thinking Canada is also probably one of your key allies when it comes to this. It should be when it comes to this forest issue, because I think Canada and Russia and Brazil by far the biggest owners of forests in the world. But I did want to ask a second question connected to the BRICS, which is about this IMF special drawing rights increase. So when COVID hit last year, there was this sense of what could the wealthier countries do for the rest of the world. And it's taken a while, but the IMF special drawing rights expansion is coming maybe in August. And then there's this talk led by Macron, who's pushed the agenda out of France, of the richer countries, the wealthier countries, giving up some of their allocation of special drawing rights and handing that on to further help the lower income countries who don't get very much in August from this proposal, but maybe they will if France allocates its money, and maybe the UK. I read the other day that China's thinking about it, or is prepared to consider. I think it gets something like $40 billion from the special drawing rights increase. It might do something with that allocation. Russia, I think, gets at least 20 billion, heading on towards 30 billion. I'm just curious whether there could be some cooperation on the BRICS side about how to address this sort of what to do with the IMF special drawing rights increase.
we are very, very open for further discussion on this and further debate on this. I do recognize that there might be areas where BRICS participating states do not necessarily look eye for eye on these issues, but it's undeniable that the need for the international community to do more in terms of assisting countries with lowest income, and also to do more in terms of assisting sustainable growth at levels that would bring the world economy out of last year's shock sooner rather than later, that this need is recognized by everyone. We used to have specialized formats for intra-BRICS exchanges, dialogue, and eventual coordination even on the Bretton Woods agenda. Earlier, there was a particular area of our focused interest as BRICS, and that was a reform of national quotas, which moves forward pretty slowly in our view, but so we cannot change the world around ourselves, especially not overnightly, but we will persevere here. On special drawing rights, I know for sure that this is an area that attaches considerable attention on the part of our Ministry of Finance and other agencies that are directly engaged into it. We do not, reject any of the ideas. The problem would be just to find the right way to go. And as ever on such issues, there might be some, I would say, overly far-reaching attitudes and approaches, something that is more conservative and less effective. We should find something in between, and Russia would be very ready to continue exchanges both within BRICS. Hopefully we would be able to do so as BRICS, but I don't know if it is feasible, but also in direct contact with IMF.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that answer.
So one other item on your very large table is Iran. Maybe you could give us 2 or 3 minutes of where we are now in the negotiations. We had the elections recently. We had a recent round of meetings in Vienna. What's your assessment of where we stand?
Currently, there is a break in Vienna. The 6th round is over. And if we measure where we are in terms of how diplomats were able to remove brackets and agree on particular language, we have reached a stage very close to a final push. That's not an exaggeration. But as ever, the final inch is the hardest one to cover, and all the major political decisions should be taken in capitals. These days, there is always an attempt by any delegation at negotiating table to squeeze everything what is possible out of the current situation until the very last moment. But differently from some other negotiations where I was present, currently we have a reasonably good understanding of a sketch of the overall final outcome. And it is almost just about a political decision or political decisions to be taken in respective capitals to which we call them for. And it relates both to US and Iran. There are some areas where the US should, in our view, show a measure of additional flexibility. The Iranians should be, in our view, less ambitious on some political aspects of this overall posturing. And then, as we have been able to prove before, the six-party talks format, although with the US this time is just proximity talks, but so what? We have been able, not least because of a very thoughtful and proactive approach of the European External Action Service that coordinates the effort, we have been able to reach this almost finished kind of stage. So I am reasonably optimistic. I would say that in my view, it will take, of course, it will not take months. It may take weeks, but if all the necessary decisions are taken and the final push is arrived at in Vienna, then technically speaking, it would be possible to finish all this within days. So we will continuously work to this end. And as I said, the small steps approach can be applied many places. This is one of the areas where we should deliver.
If I could ask, I like to try and keep as many things simple in my mind as possible. Not quite Steve Jobs, who always wore the same black polo neck top every day so that he didn't have to think. But is the simplest way to think about this new deal with Iran as it brings us back to where we were before Trump? Or is there going to be significant difference that we in the markets might need to pay attention to? I mean, can I be lazy about this and think it's about trying to restore the status quo from 5 years ago, or do I have to read another treaty?
It will be a restoration of a status quo ante as of 2018 before Trump departed. But the question which remains to be answered is what's next, and what is the degree of commitment of all parties involved to do this next. So this is both. Formally speaking, it's a return back to the original JCPOA, but then also an opening for something that would follow. This is exactly where we are.
What sort of that status quo back then was good enough pre-2018. It was good enough for Renaissance Capital to be looking into Iran about the potential for investment if global investors might start to put money there, like Total did. We did start looking. That's good enough potentially for investors to start thinking again about the country and to get a bit calmer. So where are you thinking this could go?
I'm not supposed to talk on what exactly transpires at negotiating table, but speaking generically and trying to give a picture with the broad strokes, I would say that re-establishment of the original JCPOA, and that is removal of the bulk of the US sanctions, would not be the end in itself. And further diplomatic efforts might follow if we are lucky in terms of our current negotiating efforts.
It'd be nice to see. It'd be nice to see some improvement in a problem area that's been such a problem for so many decades. That would be great. I think I'm complete.
All right.
Okay.
I don't know whether we have any questions or no extra questions. Thank you.
I think we're up to our 40 minutes allotted time. Thank you very much indeed. Once again, Minister Ryabkov, for joining us. All of us, the audience included, Charlie and myself, really appreciated and enjoyed hearing your thoughts on a very wide range of topics. We really appreciate that. It's very important for both investors and ourselves to maintain this open dialogue thank you for your time today in doing that. And we hope very much to be back in person, live in Moscow next year. And we'd like to invite you to come to our conference once more, if you're available then. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's hope so. I will be delighted. Thank you for your time, and thank you for having me once again. Thanks.
Cheers. Bye.
Knowledge is information, but not all information turns into knowledge. Today, every company leaves digital footprints in hundreds of different sources. But this information by itself does not tell you who it is you're looking at and what the risks of doing business with them are. Businesses can't exist in a vacuum. They need employees, customers, partners, contractors, investors. Good counteragents help a company succeed, create products, make profit, expand business opportunities. But what about bad ones? 49% of organizations around the world say that they've been victims of fraud or economic crime. 2/3 of Russian companies say they've encountered economic crime in the past 2 years. This is significantly higher than the global average. Every year, 15% of companies simply disappear, whether on their own initiative or because they're forced to do so by tax bodies, often leaving unpaid debts. If you want to minimize your risk, you need to find and analyze every scrap of information you can, identifying, analyzing, collecting facts. Processing big data is impossible without qualified specialists, experience, time, expensive equipment, new technology, machine learning, graphs. Spark Interfax gathers information from all available sources and converts it into knowledge, allowing you to see the world of business in its entirety with all its risks and opportunities. And there's no doubt that tomorrow we'll be able to understand the world of business even better, thanks to the emerging digital economy, cutting-edge technology, and the availability of new information about the lives of companies. Knowledge decreases risks and creates trust, the foundation of any successful business. Knowledge is information, but not all information turns into knowledge. Today, every company leaves digital footprints in hundreds of different sources. But this information by itself does not tell you who it is you're looking at and what the risks of doing business with them are. Businesses can't exist in a vacuum. They need employees, customers, partners, contractors, investors. Good counteragents help a company succeed, create products, make profit, expand business opportunities. But what about bad ones? 49% of organizations around the world say that they've been victims of fraud or economic crime. 2/3 of Russian companies say they've encountered economic crime in the past 2 years. This is significantly higher than the global average. Every year, 15% of companies simply disappear, whether on their own initiative or because they're forced to do so by tax bodies, often leaving unpaid debts. If you want to minimize your risk, you need to find and analyze every scrap of information you can, identifying, analyzing, collecting facts. Processing big data is impossible without qualified specialists, experience, time, expensive equipment, new technology, machine learning, graphs. Spark Interfax gathers information from all available sources and converts it into knowledge, allowing you to see the world of business in its entirety with all its risks and opportunities. And there's no doubt that tomorrow we'll be able to understand the world of business even better, thanks to the emerging digital economy, cutting-edge technology, and the availability of new information about the lives of companies. Knowledge decreases risks and creates trust, the foundation of any successful business. Knowledge is information, but not all information turns into knowledge. Today, every company leaves digital footprints in hundreds of different sources. But this information by itself does not tell you who it is you're looking at and what the risks of doing business with them are. Businesses can't exist in a vacuum. They need employees, customers, partners, contractors, investors. Good counteragents help a company succeed, create products, make profit, expand business opportunities. But what about bad ones? 49% of organizations around the world say that they've been victims of fraud or economic crime. 2/3 of Russian companies say they've encountered economic crime in the past 2 years. This is significantly higher than the global average. Every year, 15% of companies simply disappear, whether on their own initiative or because they're forced to do so by tax bodies, often leaving unpaid debts. If you want to minimize your risk, you need to find and analyze every scrap of information you can, identifying, analyzing, collecting facts. Processing big data is impossible without qualified specialists, experience, time, expensive equipment, new technology, machine learning, graphs. Spark Interfax gathers information from all available sources and converts it into knowledge, allowing you to see the world of business in its entirety with all its risks and opportunities. And there's no doubt that tomorrow we'll be able to understand the world of business even better, thanks to the emerging digital economy, cutting-edge technology, and the availability of new information about the lives of companies. Knowledge decreases risks and creates trust, the foundation of any successful business. Knowledge is information, but not all information turns into knowledge. Today, every company leaves digital footprints in hundreds of different sources. But this information by itself does not tell you who it is you're looking at and what the risks of doing business with them are. Businesses can't exist in a vacuum. They need employees, customers, partners, contractors, investors. Good counteragents help a company succeed, create products, make profit, expand business opportunities. But what about bad ones? 49% of organizations around the world say that they've been victims of fraud or economic crime. 2/3 of Russian companies say they've encountered economic crime in the past 2 years. This is significantly higher than the global average. Every year, 15% of companies simply disappear, whether on their own initiative or because they're forced to do so by tax bodies, often leaving unpaid debts. If you want to minimize your risk, you need to find and analyze every scrap of information you can, identifying, analyzing, collecting facts. Processing big data is impossible without qualified specialists, experience, time, expensive equipment, new technology, machine learning, graphs. Spark Interfax gathers information from all available sources and converts it into knowledge, allowing you to see the world of business in its entirety with all its risks and opportunities. And there's no doubt that tomorrow we'll be able to understand the world of business even better, thanks to the emerging digital economy, cutting-edge technology, and the availability of new information about the lives of companies. Knowledge decreases risks and creates trust, the foundation of any successful business. Knowledge is information, but not all information turns into knowledge. Today, every company leaves digital footprints in hundreds of different sources. But this information by itself does not tell you who it is you're looking at and what the risks of doing business with them are. Businesses can't exist in a vacuum. They need employees, customers, partners, contractors, investors. Good counteragents help a company succeed, create products, make profit, expand business opportunities. But what about bad ones? 49% of organizations around the world say that they've been victims of fraud or economic crime. 2/3 of Russian companies say they've encountered economic crime in the past 2 years. This is significantly higher than the global average. Every year, 15% of companies simply disappear, whether on their own initiative or because they're forced to do so by tax bodies, often leaving unpaid debts. If you want to minimize your risk, you need to find and analyze every scrap of information you can, identifying, analyzing, collecting facts. Processing big data is impossible without qualified specialists, experience, time, expensive equipment, new technology, machine learning, graphs. Spark Interfax gathers information from all available sources and converts it into knowledge, allowing you to see the world of business in its entirety with all its risks and opportunities. And there's no doubt that tomorrow we'll be able to understand the world of business even better, thanks to the emerging digital economy, cutting-edge technology, and the availability of new information about the lives of companies. Knowledge decreases risks and creates trust, the foundation of any successful business.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Daniel Salter, the Chief Equity Strategist at Renaissance Capital, and one of the best parts of my job is when I get to sit down with business leaders, innovators, and disruptors. Ivan Tavarin is certainly all three of those, and I think we can safely add media mogul on top of that, something I hope he won't object to. So by way of brief introduction, Ivan is the founder of Media One, one of Russia's largest independent media groups, which includes Muz TV, Russia's equivalent of MTV, as well as the Disney Channel. Media One also controls Russia's leading radio network and Russia's largest digital billboards operator. Ivan also controls a company called Vertical, which is one of Russia's leading independent telecom towers operators. He was CEO of Megafon from 2012 until 2016, where he brought one of Russia's leading mobile operators to the market. And if that isn't enough, his investment company, Kismet Capital, has listed 3 SPACs on NASDAQ, raising between them $700 million, the first of which has successfully closed a merger with the game developer Nexters. Ivan, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Daniel, good morning, and thank you very much for having me. Thanks a lot.
Good to have you here. Now, before we dive into some of your latest ventures, maybe you could give us 2 minutes on who is Ivan Tavarin. How did you get into the media business initially? And what drives you? Is it about communication, new technologies, deal making, the money making opportunity? What drives you?
Look, I think the reason why I'm in media, I would say, is because of 2 people. One of them is my father, who told me right in the beginning of the 90s when I just entered the university, is that being and working in advertising is something which will be interesting for me years and years going forward. He just thought that I will start working in advertising when I will graduate from the university, but I started doing it on the first week when I just started being in the university. And the second person is my partner in media between 2000 and 2008, Tim McDonald, a US veteran whom we built together TV3, which is one of the largest television stations, television networks, which we put together during many years in 2000s and finally sold it. Actually, RANCAP was our banker in the end of 2006 to Prof Media for more than $500 million. So this is 2 reasons why I'm in media, 2 personal why. And I would say that definitely media was the only part of my business story and the most active part of my business story in 2000s and in the end of 90s. While starting from my Megaphone days, I'm not really too much involved in it, but it's still a very important part of our Kismet ownership operations and a great asset to own.
Great. We'll certainly get to the 2020s shortly. But in general, you've got businesses at various stages of maturity right now. You've got media assets in TV, radio, and advertising, the largest independent media portfolio in Russia. You've got Vertical, Russia's largest telecom tower business. And then you've got private equity and SPACs within Kismet Capital, which I guess is where a lot of the future growth is likely to be. I mean, how do you look at that mix, the portfolio you have? Are you trying to balance between future growth businesses and cash generation? Do you look to exit the maturer businesses over time? How do you see the mix changing?
Look, the reason, when we founded Kismet in 2016, we basically started with our media businesses. So we own 3 television networks, including our joint venture with Disney, Muz TV, and You, which is a reality channel. We owned our radio business. And first, we just wanted to diversify out of media and start to look at something new. So we started to look at the assets in Russia, which we can buy, operate, control, change them for good, and implement our strategy. But also we wanted to look internationally. So internationally, we started to invest into growth companies. We started to invest in funds. We became LPs of great funds, like some of them are US funds or European funds. And we started to be an active investor in in emerging growth companies out of Europe, Russia, etc. So this is how we ended up to own a share and stake in the companies like Ozon, Headhunter, Auto One from Germany. All of them became public at a later stage. We started to be an LP in General Atlantic, some of the Carlyle funds, some of the smaller or larger private equity shops. And this was a new strategy to start with. But in Russia, since then, we added 2 business verticals to us. One is a tower, as you mentioned, and the second one is digital outdoor advertising. These are the businesses which we actively manage and which we actively own and operate.
Okay, so if we start off with the history, I guess, media. So Media One, the only sizable private media company in Russia. I mean, in theory, that should be quite a big advantage. I'm sure it gives you some additional flexibility and maybe some complexities. Maybe it's slightly harder to exit in media in Russia. What do you find the key specifics are of the Russian media market nowadays?
Look, I think that as in many other countries, media, especially media which is involved with news, with any political agenda, etc., sometimes it becomes not a business. However, for us, we have 0 political agenda. We don't have news in any other of our businesses. We don't have anything which is connected with non-entertainment. We just do cartoons, music, shows. We do many programs in reality, so we don't really involved in any politics in one or the other shape or form. However, the media landscape all over the world is changing. So we think that all of our assets should have a strategy, and they have a strategy, how to go from yesterday, where the only revenue was advertising, to tomorrow, where you have direct-to-consumer revenue, where you have a digital component. And this is why when we bought a company, Gallery, which is the out-of-home advertising business, we implemented the strategy to digitize it. This is why our Moose TV has a strategy to work more non in advertising, but mostly in digital, to produce content for internet, to produce shows, to manage artists, to be an active player in this part of business. So I think media business in Russia, if you're not connected to news and politics, is not really different from media business in UK, US, China, or any other part of the world.
I think media which makes you happy is perhaps an easier sector to be in than media which makes you unhappy, being the news.
That's true. That's true. This is why we try to have a positive agenda, only entertainment.
Which is what we all need, certainly. So if we move forward to towers now, Russia's tower infrastructure is actually still quite dominated by the major telecom operators. 5G is on its way, which I think will need more towers closer together. How much of an opportunity do you see there for vertical? And do you think that's going to be something kind of incremental, that the market share of the independent tower operators will increase, or something a bit more seismic in that we could see entire infrastructure portfolios being offloaded over time?
Look, I think, speaking of the differences in strategy between Russia and other parts of the world, I don't think tower business will be different. It will be the same as in US, in Europe, or in other countries, including China, Latin America, or Southeast Asia. Operators don't really need to own their towers because their passive infrastructure is not a competitive advantage anymore. It's just a big part of assets on the balance sheet, which can generate some cash, but they can only generate cash in independent format. This is why the companies like American Towers, Cellnex, and others were created all around the world. And now these are companies which are worth tens and tens of billions of dollars. This is basically when telco operators, they offload their portfolios of towers, and they get this money to invest into their core business, to compete for client, to compete for a customer, to invest into this relationship. And in Russia, there are only 3 independent tower companies, and all of the portfolios are still owned by 4 major operators. So I think that there will be a consolidation, definitely, And when we started to think of it 5 years ago, or even more, when I was at Megaphone, we started to think that the time of putting those businesses together and merging some of the tower portfolios as well as independent tower companies will come. And this is why we were thinking also of raising a SPAC back then to put together some of those ideas. It definitely takes us and took us much more time, and the market hasn't started this consolidation, but I'm absolutely sure that this is something inevitable. This is something very close, and I would say that 2021 will be a year when this process will start. Whether all of the portfolios will be offloaded this year or next year or not, yet to be seen, but I think the process is here.
Great. Now, you're founder and CEO of the Kismet Capital Group, where you're investing in new businesses and becoming much more global at the same time. Can you tell us a little bit more about where you're going with Kismet? Are the new business lines an incremental shift in strategy, or does it in part reflect the potential time frame of deal flow in your existing media and telecoms businesses in Russia? Do you aim at the end of it to become a truly global company in new technologies? Where are you heading with Kismet Capital?
Look, the idea is we started Kismet Capital as a family office where we started to invest, as I mentioned, just to diversify ourselves. But then we understood that there is much more happening in started Kismet Capital as a family office where we started to invest, as I mentioned, just to diversify ourselves. But then we understood that there is much more happening in the tech space in Europe or in other parts of the world. Then we understood that Russians seem to have talent not only in tech, where they are best gamers, coders, and people who create amazing businesses in fintech, SaaS. Google is created by Russians to a certain extent. A lot of gaming companies, etc. So we understood that we should try ourselves in investing. And this is where we started to look at the businesses in Europe, where we opened an office in London. Now Kismet has 3 offices, which is Moscow, London, and Cyprus. We are thinking in opening one more hub in Dubai, which will look at that part of the region. But also, we think that digital investment became a truly business without borders, where investors from Russia can get access to companies from Africa. We have companies in our portfolio from Egypt, from United Kingdom, from Sweden, from France, from Italy, from Israel, from Russia, definitely. So it became a business without borders, and we hope that out of the family office, we started to create an investment platform, which is private today. Maybe it will be public one day. And basically the flywheel of our operations is investing as an LP into great funds, getting great deals for our SPACs in future or for our growth investment, private growth investment. Then we invest in private companies where we also create an opportunity to de-SPAC them potentially later on in the stage of their lives. But also SPAC is an important part of the strategy of the firm, where we, as you mentioned, launched 3 of them during the last 12 months. We made the first one in August and second and third in February. We are planning to make more of them, not only in the US, but in Europe as well. And this is definitely a key part of our strategy.
So maybe looking a bit more at your SPAC venture, you launched 3 SPACs. How did that decision come around? And how do you see SPACs? Do you see them as kind of accelerating the path to market for new corporates? Or you see it as some kind of democratization of the financial markets for new companies? Or just a great business opportunity, or some kind of combination of all 3?
So look, I think it's a little bit of both. We started to look at the SPACs in 2016 and 2017 when one of our board members in Megaphone, our independent director, Lord Paul Miners, chaired several of them, both in US and in London. Team, and the team who knows how to do it, which has a founder who is concentrated on a completely different thing, or which needs to offload a part of their business, is looking to merge with a public company and accelerate basically the process. So we've spent hundreds and hundreds of meetings all around the world with people who invest in SPACs, with people who knew us from my megaphone days, and we really talked a lot about it. And when you were mentioning, okay, Russia, SPAC, something else, it was a little bit too exotic for them, because people who did SPACs in US and UK were not really looking at Russia, and people who invested in Russia were not really looking at SPACs. Then in 2020, all of those things merged, and SPAC specialists started to do deals in all of the world. In US, there were like tsunami of deals, and we thought we should restart the process. We raised our first one completely by Zoom. We filed to SEC and were preparing our docs in the middle of pandemic, and then we raised it in summer. We did a roadshow in summer, and that was very good that years before we knew a lot of people whom we talked to. Now we see that SPACs are getting popular. Yeah, obviously they were extremely popular half a year ago or 3 months ago, and everybody was like looking at this. As people mentioned, some of my US friends said, I know more people who are doing SPACs than who have COVID. So everybody was thinking of it. Now it's all changing, and I think it's professionalizing to a certain extent and moving to a platform like Kismet. So we have about 30 people, out of whom today are 15 investment professionals. And if we are looking at a deal or a company to this SPAC, you have a partner who's leading the process, you have myself who is like really involved, you have a director, you have analysts, you have a lawyer, you have a financial people. So we are helping the company to prepare the accounts, to hire personnel, which is needed. I don't know, IR specialists, CFOs who are trained and used to run public companies. So if we know the process inside out, like we're doing today with Nexters, we started it in November when we signed LOI, and we are moving to a closing next month. So we already filed everything to the SEC, and we've prepared the accounts of the company, etc. So we think that the platforms who know how to do it could be a really value-add partners. But also for us, if we do a SPAC deal, it's not just help the company to go public, get a promote, and run away. This is an opportunity to invest more capital, real capital. So we invest our own money into the business, into the deal. We will be locked up to a lot of time, and in a way we are only looking at the businesses which would be SPACed by Kismet as something which will have a long view to hold, long view to support the company at the board of directors, at the management level, and overall. So this is why we think it's a very interesting opportunity for us to go forward.
Great. So I think this feeds in a bit to the next question. I mean, we're 6 months into 2021. I think we've had 345 SPAC IPOs this year. It's slowed down a little bit in the last couple of months, but over 2/3 of all US IPOs this year have been SPACs, raising $100 billion, I think, and 300 more supposedly in the pipeline. I mean, I think you've partly addressed this by talking about how important the platform is in terms of the SPAC. But how saturated do you think the market is in the US versus Europe and versus emerging markets, and how do you fit into that?
Look, I think that in US, as you just mentioned, with 100 billion of dry powder and several hundreds of vehicles raised, that means that if you put an average life of the SPAC of 18 to 24 months, that means basically a SPAC will need to announce a deal every day or even more. I think that a lot of those companies will struggle to find great assets just because there are not that many companies to go on the market. However, I think that in our part of the world, which we call like EMEA, Europe, Middle East, to a certain extent Africa, and obviously emerging markets in Eastern Europe, Russia, ex-CIS, etc. We'll definitely have a lot of opportunities, just because we still need time to catch up in terms of building tech companies. I mean, within the last 12 months, we had a jumbo IPO out of Germany, out of one, where we were an investor. There were several jumbo deals out of UK and other parts of Europe, but there were not tens of them. There's still a needle. We still need a lot of time to catch up, and we see it as an opportunity for ourselves. We are not looking at US deals. We are only looking at European deals, and this is why we have two hubs. One in Russia, one in London, where we are looking at companies and we are participating in the processes, which are from everywhere, from, I don't know, France, Denmark, Germany, Russia, etc. I think there's definitely a place for a play like us, especially with our own balance sheet, which can invest into those businesses.
And how about regulation of SPACs? So there's discussion that the SEC might make some proposals by April next year. Do you think the market itself could deal with any issues, in that the most successful platforms will gain a reputation and be the most successful at bringing SPACs to the market? Or do you think there's something that the regulator could do to help there?
Look, I think that SEC has put a lot of cold water on the SPAC market, which is the right thing to do. I mean, there were too many of them. There was too active. And people could start to lose a lot of money just because it's just became a scheme where more and more capital went to it. But also with the hike of key rate all over the world, definitely SPAC started to cool off a little bit. So I think that there will be less of them. However, people who will invest risk capital into them, and the sponsors will be more selective in the deals, and investors will be more selective in the sponsors. So I think it's a pretty healthy process going forward. And as you know, SEC started to treat warrants differently during last months. There could be some other changes, but SPAC is a product which existed for years and decades. And I'm not really sure that something will change. That was like a real boom in last 12 months. Then it will be a little bit lower, but we definitely feel a lot of comfort that people who know what they will be doing, ready to invest in those companies and supporting them into the next chapter of their public life, can have a lot of success.
Good. So your first SPAC recently merged with the gaming company Nexters. Congratulations on that. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How did you identify the company? How did you choose it? Was it the sector first, then the company, or you had a huge list from which to choose from? Was it tough to persuade the management team that they should list? Obviously, when you're a listed company, your requirements are a lot harder than they are when you're unlisted. Take us through that a bit.
Absolutely. Look, when we went to investors last August and people asked us, where are you going to look? What are you going to invest in? What are the sectors you like? We were a little bit, now we are openly telling that we are looking at businesses in Europe as well as in Russia and former Soviet Union. But then we were a little bit more cautious and telling them, okay, we want to find a Russian company or a company with Russian roots, which is invented by Russians, which is playing in international arena, but also with an idea to put together more businesses, to use it as a platform to invest further, like we did in television, like we did in towers, like we are doing it in other businesses. So what could be better than consolidating gaming sector? What could be more interesting than putting together the businesses in the gaming sector? Because A, the market is definitely here. B, Russian founders created a truly global businesses. They created truly global stories. And they are not only working in Russian market, they are working, I mean, Russian gaming companies founded by Russians are active in US, in Europe, in Latin America, in other parts. So then we met Andrei Fadeev, who is the CEO of Nexters, and Boris Gertsovsky. They are two co-founders who are supported by Dmitry and Igor Buchmans, the founders of Playrix, one of the most successful gaming companies in the world. And we met them, we started to look at what could be done together. And actually, we did a pretty fast deal. I mean, we met in September, we shook hands in November, we signed LOI in December, and we announced the deal on 1st of February. There were several months of work non-stop, our team, Nexters team, etc. But we are really happy that we can use it as a platform for consolidation. Once it will be public, we will have our stock as a currency to pay for other acquisitions. And there are several amazing examples in US like Zynga, or in Sweden like Embracer or Stillfront, where people built multi-billion-dollar businesses with actually very small games, where you can really add a lot into the platform. So this is our idea going forward. This is why we like gaming, and this is why we're very active in the sector.
Sounds very exciting. Now, looking forward, does gaming or Russia give us any clue to where SPACs 2 and 3 might end up? And why did you launch 2 simultaneously? Is it easier to launch 2 at once, or do you already have some targets in mind which gave you the confidence to launch 2 companies? And you mentioned more SPACs perhaps on the way one day. Any ideas when we could see SPACs 4 and 5?
Look, I think first of all, the reason why we mentioned 2nd and 3 it was because it was February. One of the hottest months in SPACs ever. So we decided to simultaneously launch 2nd and 3 in order we will be spending time on finding a great opportunity rather than on constant fundraising. And when we were raising 2nd and 3 for $450 million book for 2 of them, we had more than 6 billion of demand. So it was like a tech IPO with 15 times oversubscribed. We, as well as our advisors, were really surprised that the market puts a lot of belief into it. But again, it was not only a function of Kismet, but a function of the market back then. So we decided to raise 2 just to have them, to look at different stories, to have a bigger bandwidth. Obviously, we are not planning to de-SPAC another gaming company, because it can compete with Nexters, and we don't want to. We see Nexters as a very active part of our portfolio, where we will really spend a lot of time on working. I will be on the board of directors, and the team will help with everything, IR, M&A, financials, etc. So Kismet is very heavily involved. And we will be looking at the businesses both in Russia, and we are looking at the businesses both in Russia as well as internationally with 2 angles. First, tech. Second, roll-up strategy. We like where we can do roll-ups, and we like we can do tech.
Yeah, so Nexters is domiciled in Cyprus, but run by Russians. How important was that Cyprus domicile to you? Would you consider deals actually on the ground in Russia? Is that something you think your shareholders are ready for?
Oh, of course, of course. I think that Nexters was domiciled in Russia because, at the time when they moved there, and it happened years ago, it was easier for them to deal with App Store, to deal with other things, to collect cash for the games. And look, Hero Wars is one of the top grossing games in Europe. So they wanted to be in Europe. The founders wanted to be in Europe. They wanted to be considered as a European company. But Cyprus is a very convenient place for them, where on one hand, you don't lose connection with Russian tech community. There are like 10,000 coders and tech people based in Cyprus. But also, it was not far from home. I mean, just a 3-hour flight. And people speak a lot of Russian there. So there are a lot of gaming companies. And whether investors should look at something, but we will bring something domiciled in Russia, obviously, of course. I mean, we are constantly looking and evaluating opportunities of Russian businesses. I think the fact that only during last 12 to 24 months, there was an IPO for Zone, which is a super e-commerce company. There was an IPO in Headhunter, which is also an amazing business, shows that investors still have confidence in Russian consumers. We have about 150 people, 150 million people. We have a pretty big economy. Yes, of course, there are some issues with sanctions, US-Russia relationship. Hopefully it will be better. But I think we need to look at it from the perspective that Russia will have great stories. Yes, of course, we are not really investing our own money into oil and gas or into something of that kind. But there will be a lot of businesses consumer-oriented, and that will be and still is a focus for Kismet. This is why the core part of our office is in Moscow, and this is why I hope that we'll bring great deals to the market.
Now, SPACs have traditionally been NASDAQ listed, given the very deep pool of capital there. Is NASDAQ still very much the venue of choice for listing? Are there any other jurisdictions starting to step up, or you hear anything in Russia or some of the European countries that they want to develop SPACs on the ground in those countries?
Yeah, obviously, I think that NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange are still the venues of choice for a lot of businesses. But Europe has started to play an active role as well. So Frankfurt did several vehicles, Amsterdam is active, and we've looked at Amsterdam as well. And we think that it all depends not really on the venue and the capital. Capital is flying both ways. It depends on where the business should be focused. So if you have peers in NASDAQ, that's an important factor. But also for technological businesses, probably NASDAQ is the best venue. Whether this business is from Russia, China, Germany, or whatever, investors in NASDAQ, they like tech companies and they are prepared to look at them, they're prepared to invest in them, and that's still an interesting choice. Russia might do a SPAC one day as well in the Moscow Stock Exchange. I mean, I heard that there were some discussions in the government to look at this vehicle for a faster IPO of the business.
Good. Now, stepping back a bit from SPACs, SPACs clearly typically target slightly larger companies, maybe at slightly later stage in their development, but you've also got a lot of experience in investing in smaller startups at an early stage, both in Russia and globally. Now, what do you think about the Russian venture capital market in general? Are there some parts of the ecosystem which are working well and some parts which are working less well? And where do you see as the most promising sectors or industries for those early stage investments over the short to medium term?
Look, first of all, I need to admit that Kismet investments in early stage companies, we did two, have completely failed. So we did one in 16, the other one is probably 18 or 19. They completely failed. It was not a success. But also when you look at venture, we looked at venture from the operator's perspective. Okay, we see the story, we buy it out, we fix it, etc. But if we fix the existing company with a lot of revenues, with a lot of time in the market, this is one thing. This is where we are good at. If you're doing something early stage, you need a founder. You need somebody who's super active. You need somebody who is super focused, laser focused on operations day to day. And that was our mistake. So I think the lessons learned. And I think that the venture type of investments in Russian companies would be a part of Kismet's strategy as well going forward. Not only because we think it's our, it's our desire and it's our, we need to support the young entrepreneurs just because we know how to invest companies and we know how business model works. But also I think because more and more Russians are building global businesses. There are businesses which are built in SaaS, which are really founded by Russians. There are businesses in fintech, in neo-banking, founded by Russians in Germany or in other parts of Europe. There are businesses in food delivery. The Samokat, which is a leading Russian food delivery platform, founders are moving and starting a business in New York. So there will be more and more businesses which would be founded by Russians, but aiming new territories. And I think that to invest in those businesses in a purely minority positions in a really venture style would be a part of strategy of Kismet going forward.
Ivan, this sounds all extremely exciting. We could talk for hours about it, but sadly, our time is up. It's been really a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for all your insights and your time. We look forward to following all your ventures in the future. And I'd like to thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Daniel, thank you very much for your time. Wish you a great conference. 25 years is a lot. And it's very good to hear that the firms like Renaissance Capital are still here doing the deals, doing the conferences, but even in a new format. I remember I was at one of the conferences like 15 years ago. Like it was obviously live. Nobody thought of Zoom back then, but have a great day, have a great conference, and thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Knowledge is information, but not all information turns into knowledge. Today, every company leaves digital footprints in hundreds of different sources. But this information by itself does not tell you who it is you're looking at and what the risks of doing business with them are. Businesses can't exist in a vacuum. They need employees, customers, partners, contractors, investors. Good counteragents help a company succeed, create products, make profit, expand business opportunities. But what about bad ones? 49% of organizations around the world say that they've been victims of fraud or economic crime. 2/3 of Russian companies say they've encountered economic crime in the past 2 years. This is significantly higher than the global average. Every year, 15% of companies simply disappear, whether on their own initiative or because they're forced to do so by tax bodies, often leaving unpaid debts. If you want to minimize your risk, you need to find and analyze every scrap of information you can, identifying, analyzing, collecting facts. Processing big data is impossible without qualified specialists, experience, time, expensive equipment, new technology, machine learning, graphs. Spark Interfax gathers information from all available sources and converts it into knowledge, allowing you to see the world of business in its entirety with all its risks and opportunities. And there's no doubt that tomorrow we'll be able to understand the world of business even better, thanks to the emerging digital economy, cutting-edge technology, and the availability of new information about the lives of companies. Knowledge decreases risks and creates trust, the foundation of any successful business.